Good evening, everybody. We're just waiting for the last few people to join in. All right, before we get started, I am going to go over all of the kind of Zoom logistics, and then we'll take a roll call. So if you are having any audio problems, you can contact me, Jen Oden, at 425-531-1933. We're asking that everyone please keep muted when you're not speaking. And if you would like to speak, please use the raise hand function. I believe that you can find that at the bottom of your screen. Please refrain for speaking unless called upon. So we will call upon you after you raise your hand. If you are calling from a phone, which I don't see anybody is now, you can use *6 to toggle between mute and unmute, and *9 to raise your hand. And I just want to remind everybody that this meeting is recorded so that we can share it with the public. Marissa, you can take a roll call.
Okay, Jen, do you want to introduce yourself real quick first?
Sure, I'm Jen Oden and I work for Snohomish County Surface Water Management Lakes Program, and I will be doing the logistical things in the background.
Okay, so I'm just going to read off who's here so we can mark everybody. As you know, your volunteer time is part of your community's match, so we want to make sure we're reflecting that. So is Lonnie Hall here?
Yes.
Okay, Lena Coleman-Meyer. Okay, so Lena's not here yet. Has anybody heard from her? If she's planning on coming, maybe just a little late? Okay, not sure. Okay, Christine Feldman. Okay. Actually, I can actually see you. So yeah, you can just wave. I'm going to move this over here so I can see you. David Pugh.
Here.
Okay. Ron and Ruth Johnson.
Yeah, both here.
Okay. Melanie Krieger.
I'm here.
Spelled wrong. Now Melania, but fix that. Allison. Don't see Allison yet. Alex, I see you there.
Hi.
Kelly.
Here.
Hey, Kelly. Okay. Is that Michelle?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. And Alyssa. Looks like
Here.
Okay. All right. So we're just hopefully Allison and Lena will be joining us. Is there anybody from the board that I missed that's also here just for sake of? Looks like we got everybody. Okay.
Yeah, this is Brian. Remember, I'm on.
Oh, Brian. Okay, that makes sense. And I'm Marissa Bergdorf. We all know each other now, I think. I'm the Lakes Program Manager and have been working with a lot of you on this grant thus far. And tonight, the presentation will mostly be on Tetra Tech, so I'll be more just filling in gaps here and there from the county perspective. So without further ado, we're going to move on to Shannon to get the meeting kicked off. And Allison, I see you just joined us. We just took attendance, so I'm going to go ahead and add you to that list.
All right, Marissa, when you get a chance, do you want to go to the next slide? Hi, all. Thanks again for joining us tonight. I am Shannon Bradabo. I work for Tetra Tech, and I'm the project manager of this project. And also from Tetra Tech, we have Dr. Harry Gibbons, who has a vast amount of experience managing aquatic plants in the state of Washington. And we also have Dr. Tony Pennington with ESA, and Harry and Tony are plant experts and are up to speed on all of the management options and emerging technologies, and pretty much know the most about plants. I know just enough to get myself in trouble. So next slide, please. So the agenda is a little bit different than what you saw in the email that Marissa sent out at the end of last week, but I'll just briefly go over it. We have a lot to talk about tonight, and it's going to be a 3-hour meeting. Maybe not, maybe we'll get through it faster. But so if you need to walk away for a while or excuse yourself, just go ahead and do that. Don't feel like you have to be glued to your screen for 3 hours straight. But We wanted to first start off by revisiting the management goals and kind of share with the committee the feedback, the survey results from the survey you guys all took on the goals. And then we're going to do a brief review of all of the control options that we looked at, even the ones that we looked at but rejected. And then we're going to go into a more in-depth look at the best options for the lake. Then we're going to talk about the meat of the meeting will be on talking about the management alternatives. And these will be the tables in the plan that were supposed to be labeled tables 8.4a through 8.4e. They were the main tables in section 8.4, but it looks like when we saved the document into a PDF, some of the formatting got messed up. So, but those were the tables that went through the various different goals for each plant and then the available management options. So we'll spend most of our time talking about that, and we will do a few Zoom polls, kind of like voting, asking for your opinion on which option we should recommend to the community, or that the committee should take back to the community as their recommended control option. And then Marissa has put together some education plan components that she'll share with you, as well as some funding opportunities and grants, and then we'll talk about the next steps. All right, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we sent out that survey asking for your feedback from the last meeting on when we sort of tried to drill down the project goals and problem statements. And thank you all for participating in that survey. It was quite awesome to have such a good outcome and feedback. And so we just wanted to kind of touch on what we did and how we revised some of the goals based on that feedback. So the overall goal is to reduce the distribution and density of the invasive aquatic and shoreline plants in Lake Roesiger. And then most of the goal of these overarching goals, we did not change, maybe just some slight text changes to make them a little bit more consistent with the survey feedback. But we did end up adding the goal there on the bottom of your screen, the fifth bullet, to develop a comprehensive education and outreach plan for the community. This goal was added to the plan as a direct result of the feedback that the committee gave us during that survey. So, and it's a good goal, and it's probably one that we should have had in there to begin with. So next slide, please. So here is a little summary table of the survey results, and as well as what the Post-it note sticky board ended up looking like at the end of the meeting when we tried to organize all of the different overarching goals and the plant species goals. But you can see that you all were pretty in line with each other in terms of whether the goals looked good or whether you generally agreed with the goal but would like to have some text revised. And so with the Eurasian water milfoil and the Slender Arrowhead, there's a pretty good consensus on the goal, as well as the shoreline plants. And then it got a little bit more separated with the fragrant water lily. But we just wanted to show you guys that overall, there was some pretty good consensus with the group. Next slide. And there was great consensus within the committee on the priority rankings of the plant species. So 8 out of 12 folks said that Eurasian water milfoil should be the first priority when it comes to control, with the fragrant water lily as the second priority. And then the shoreline species came in as the third ranking priority, with Slender Arrowhead as the fourth and Education as the fifth. So again, a pretty good consensus across the committee. And I apologize for if I look over to my right, because I have two screens going on with lots of notes on one side, and I don't want to forget anything. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the plant-specific management goals. And the Eurasian water milfoil goal was set to eradicate the remaining small infestations and continue monitoring efforts to identify any new infestations within the lake. And this goal did not change based on any feedback from the survey. So this was the goal that we took moving forward when we started to consider control options. Next slide, please. There was some feedback from the survey regarding the fragrant water lily overall arching goal, and we wanted to have some discussion within the committee on whether some of the text of this goal should be changed. And I believe that it originally said full eradication of the water lily was the desired goal. That was our bad. We should have made sure that that said non-native lily. We understand that the community does not want to eradicate all of the lilies in the lake. There are some native lilies that are beneficial to the lake ecosystem. And so we want to make sure we have added the words non-native to that goal. But, and I'm going to ask Harry to talk a little bit about his experience with working with the Department of Ecology and why we think you should still keep this statement in, but maybe soften the language a little bit. So Harry, do you want to talk a little bit about why the goal of eradication is good in terms of how the Department of Ecology looks at it?
Shannon, before you do that, it might be helpful to share the feedback on this, which I think was that there was one or two members that did not want to say that eradication was the goal, is why this conversation is starting.
Yes, thank you. Yes, there was some feedback that that some folks thought that this was not the goal of the community, so we needed to revise this goal. Harry, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are.
So to include the eradication of a non-native plant for future funding and consideration, as well as approval of this plan, is an important thing to include. It doesn't mean that you have to achieve it. It just means that it is on the table and you're trying to do what you can do. Because that is also kind of on their list of, well, if you're still a source for other water bodies downstream and boats coming in and taking it out, as well as wildlife, that's a problem. So by saying that that's a desired attempt to do, but with realistic concerns of cost and how dense it is and other things, those are considerations. So if you go for a grant, by having that wording in it, not that you're asking the grant to eradicate, but you have recognized you want to beat it back as much as you can, it just puts you in a better position for permits, and also for permits, because they want that kind of thing done as opposed to hurting native plants. So.
Yeah, so on the bottom of the slide, we have taken a shot of how we think that the goal can be revised, but still meet both what ecology is looking for in terms of these non-native plants and the community's effort of getting them under control and stopping the spread to other water bodies, but also recognizing that maybe this isn't the desired goal of everyone in the community. And so Jen has set up a series of polls in Zoom, and we thought that would be the best way to get feedback. But at this time, if there's anybody that has any discussion or comments that they would like to talk about, please feel free to raise your hands, and we would like to know if you think that this statement should be changed, if you're okay with it the way it is, or what are your thoughts? We would like to have some discussion if we can.
And I just want everyone to know that the raise hand function should be in the reactions section, probably at the bottom of your screen if you are on a desktop or laptop.
Should we try our first poll then?
Sure. So I will launch the poll. Hopefully you'll be able to see it on your screen. I will read it out loud and then you can vote. This is a select one option.
One issue we might have, I think, is that Ruth and Ron are sharing a computer. Maybe if it's really, I don't know, maybe you just vote once, and if we find it's really close, we can have the other person send in private chat your response. But maybe now just vote what you think, and if it's not close, we won't worry about it.
Okay, so the first question, I'll read it out loud. So it could be small text. Should the statement be changed to full eradication of non-native lily is the desired goal of many in the community, yet this goal may be difficult to achieve given the size and longevity of the infestation. You may vote yes or no. So far 3 people have voted. I'll keep
okay?
open a few more.
Yeah,
Look
that's
okay
what
to
you're
me.
saying. It's better in the grant.
Yeah.
Ruth and Ron, oops, Lon, you're unmuted right now.
Oh,
Better for
Sorry
the
about
grant.
that.
It's better
And
for the
we can
grant permits.
go on two separate computers if we need to.
Oh, okay. You might want to set that up now and just maybe mute one of them because there's quite a few polls. If you have that option, that would be great.
Okay, we have, how many people do we have in attendance?
I think there's 10 right
we
now
have
until
9?
Ruth.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So Ruth and Ron, you can go ahead. Oh, 10 out of 10. So I'm going to end this poll and I will share the results. So 100% of you said yes.
So this is how it's all going to go for the rest of the evening, right? We're going to get
it.
100% consensus on everything. No, thank you all. This really is, developing these plans really is a challenging process, and with the community involvement and your input only makes it a much stronger plan. And so we want to make sure that we capture all of your thoughts and your feedback. And so again, thank you for participating. And I'm sure you will be tired of Zoom polls by the time we get done this evening. But I think that we can get to some consensus going forward. So next slide, please. Okay, so as I'm sure you all can imagine, there was a little bit more diversity in the answers for the fragrant water lily goals. And these in particular were the sub goals, and we asked you all to rank the priority of these fragrant water lily goals. And there was some consensus and a lot of spread across the different goals. And that's okay, because that's what we expect. You all live in different parts of the lake. And so this plant in particular impacts people in different ways. But for the most part, the goals, we did add one goal there. You can see underlined. We added the goal, educate landowners on available control options for fragrant water lilies so that they can individually implement near their shorelines to complement and support the overall community plan. And I think that's a great goal that we ended up adding to the plan. Some feedback we received from the survey involved whether we or whether you as a committee include navigation to homes within within the navigation sub goal, or do you want to include that as a separate goal? And so the one in red there, improve the navigation between basins and keep navigation channels open. Do you want that to include navigation to individual homes, or should that be a separate goal? And just because it may be a goal within the plan and something that perhaps you want to achieve, these goals can be adapted throughout this process. So you can change them, revise them as we go through the different management options. you may come back and want to revise a goal because you don't think that that's something you want to try and achieve at that moment. So just keep that with an open mind. These plans can be adapted and the goals can be revised. Melanie?
I had this idea of wondering, because not everyone, as we know, not everyone actually wants to get rid of the lily pads. There's some people that have said, oh, I like them in front of my house. And my concern is that we pay for putting in a path to everyone's house. In some cases, we're just throwing away money because that's not something they want and it's not something they're interested in maintaining. So I don't know if it's ever been done that there's some sort of matching, that we could do a matching pot where people who wanted to perhaps even clear lots of lilies in front of their house could receive, we could have a pot of matching funds, and people who wanted to do a greater clearing could put up some of their own money, and then the community would pay for some of that too. It would go toward the overall goal of eradicating more, and we'd get double the coverage for the same dollar for people who wanted to work in front of their own properties. So I don't know if that's ever been done, but some sort of matching pot might be an interesting way to designate some of our funds.
So it almost sounds like that would be a good place to put it as a separate goal.
Yes.
Yeah. David?
I was curious if you have any recommendations. I think that we could make a case. I would think that you could make a case for individual homeowners having some responsibility for their own shoreline and their navigation to their own dock. I mean, I'd love to have assistance. I would be one of the ones that would be in the worst condition. But that said, I guess what recommendations do you have?
Harry or Tony, I would defer to you for, we will talk about recommendations for control options later on when we get to fragrant water lily. That is quite the most complicated one, I would say. So unless Tony or Harry, do you have anything that you could add real quick?
Well, a quick response would be having some navigation goals between the shoreline and availability for people to make it to the main channel to go to, so they can use all three basins. It in the long term adds to the property value in the mid basin. If you limit the ability, except for the homeowners that can handle it themselves, when they're really blocked in and they can't, that's too much for them as individuals, that impacts their property value over time as well as their neighbors. So having a community discussion of this isn't a community thing, not just to benefit me and my house, but we need to make sure that, but the channel, the shoreline between the docks and the shore, that's an individual thing, but to get out so that you can get into the main channel, that becomes more of a long-term property value as well as, community activity. So that's really, the community has to vote, say they want to do this or not, and we'll get into that discussion. But for right now, not having, and I've in other lakes where we've had channels for navigation or skiing maintained and then surrounded by lilies, and the shore owners can't get to that channel or the lake itself, that's become an issue. And eventually it turned around that everybody said, okay, let's put in a narrower channel outside of everybody's dock so that they, and then with different channels then going to the main channel so that they can interact with everybody else in the lake. So it's, that's just what I've seen in the past.
Yeah. How about we hear from Ron and then Allison, and then let's launch the poll and see what we get. Ron, would you like to go first?
Sure. I just threw one up in the chat, but I place it as a separate goal. And in part, it's because as you get close to the shoreline, some homeowners may or may not agree with the whatever eradication we're doing, i.e. if it's chemical, you get the folks that I don't want any chemicals anywhere near my property kind of thing. They can do it themselves, whatever. But yeah, I'd say keep it as a separate goal.
I think that's a good point and valid. And the point is keeping it on the table, whether it's separate or incorporated, is an important thing. And like you say, having it separate may be the most advantageous way to move forward.
Allison?
I agree with what Ron is saying too. And also I love the fact that Melanie's got an idea that trying to promote them doing some sort of clearing of their own. I think education is going to be a huge, huge deal. We've got a neighbor on the North Lake that's right before the channel, and he's been talked to about his lily pads. And could he maybe start looking into doing something about it? And his response was he likes the lily pads because he believes it keeps people from getting onto his property and stealing stuff from the shoreline. So you're going to get any variety of people that don't want to do something. And I think education is going to be one of the major things. But ultimately, I think it's going to be extremely cost prohibitive to try to do something for every single landowner on the property or on the lake in order to reach all of the different houses so they can get out to the shore. I think we've got a lot of opportunities in play of how they can get that done. And if we support them with that, I think that would suffice.
Yeah.
Shannon, real quick, just as a point of remembering this for us, I think you bring up a really good point that when we go to write and flesh out these plans, we need to include learning from the landowners, or something about surveying the landowners that are affected, if they're interested in the control or not, is going to be a really key thing too that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, you're right. This is so, and I was going to mention this at the beginning and I totally forgot, but this has got to be one of the most complicated plans that I have ever been a part of. It is quite complex. You have a lot of non-native plants, and with the 3 different basins, there's a lot to cover and a lot of different goals. So thank you again for your participation, because I think this is going to be a great plan. It's just really complicated. Jen,
Allison, re-raised your hand, is that?
Yes. I just want to make sure that if we do something where we take a poll of the community, that we make sure that we educate them before we do the poll.
Jen?
We have Ruth.
Oh.
Ruth, you can unmute and speak.
Sure. What I find ambiguous in this is what areas are we talking about? Are we talking about the homeowners doing 15 feet out from their property or 50 feet out from their property, and then we take care of everything else? Or are they to go out that 200 or 300 feet up to where the lily pads have taken over and the channel is getting small now? Any ideas on what are we literally talking about?
I think I might take that one. This is Tony. I think really, Ruth, it might depend on the primary approach that happens in the center channel first, because that will dictate, if we imagine the channel running north and south, there are some approaches that we'll talk about in a bit that will, and I'm just making this specific dimension up, but let's say it opens up 100-foot width channel, but another one might be much more narrow. So I think that a lot of that might depend on the primary approach to clear out the center. I know that doesn't totally answer your question, but there's, like as Shannon said, there's a lot of moving parts to this, and how we get to a final answer is is going to be a bit circuitous, I think. And one thing will depend on the other. So.
I might add to that real quick. I think, Ruth, are you trying to say if we do put this as a separate goal or part of this goal, we need to define it more clearly what that means, navigation to homes?
Yes, and to give a definition of what we mean by clearing the channel.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to, when we write it, I think what the intent is, if we talked about it, I believe, was that the central navigation channel between North and South Basin, was that what we're referring to with the general navigation channel? And then the navigation to homes would be from kind of their dock out to open water, is how I believe we were discussing, or based on feedback from others. Does that seem in
But is
agreement?
the channel, do we expect the channel to be 100 or 200 feet wide or 25 feet wide? So scope of project is what I'm
right. So
looking
this,
at.
again, the scope will, like Tony said, will somewhat depend on which management goal we're looking at. But I think for most of it, it is for navigation of your boat. So narrow channels is the initial goal, at least, is my understanding of where we were headed.
Yeah. So, and I hate to be the bad person that has to cut everybody off for time, but we're already running behind. So Jen, why don't we run the poll, and then we've got one more slide before we go into the general overview of methods.
Okay, so I am launching the poll for question 2, which is, should this sub goal also include navigation to homes and or be a separate goal? Your options are include, make it separate, or remove. And I'll give a few seconds for everyone to get a chance to vote. We should have 11 votes or 10 votes. Okay, waiting for one more. Okay. And I will share the results. So it looks like 55%, so you make it separate, 36% remove it, and 9% include.
Okay. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? This is the last slide going over the management goals, and we did revise the shoreline species goal slightly based on some feedback that we received in the survey. And we added an educational component to the end of that goal. Educate landowners on ways to manage or remove shoreline species on their property, which was a very good addition to the goal. We wanted to discuss with the community, and this discussion will actually happen later on in the meeting during in the context of the management options. But we wanted to discuss and ask the committee if they thought that the community should aim to eradicate both purple loosestrife and or Japanese knotweed, given the small areas of infestation that are around the lake. And when we talk about the management alternatives later on, you will see what options are available in order to meet that goal of eradication versus reducing the coverage and the spread of purple loosestrife and Japanese knotweed. So we'll come back to this discussion point a little later on. Slender Arrowhead, this goal remained the same. There wasn't a lot of feedback associated with this goal from the committee. So the main goal for Slender Arrowhead is to prevent the spread to other water bodies and reduce the current coverage, as well as educate landowners on how they can control to allow for native plant growth, if they so desired. So those are the management specific goals. And Is there any more discussion? I've lost my little box where I can see people.
It looks like Ruth's hand is still up. Is that from before, or do you have a comment?
That was from before.
Okay.
Okay. So at this time we're only.
David?
Oh yeah,
David?
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just a clarifying question. On an issue like this, for instance, with knotweed that is actually on people's property, I'm curious how through an IAVMP process that we can actually set a goal for eradication. Doesn't that violate homeowners' rights? Or, I mean, how would you go about eradicating and telling a homeowner that either you're going to do it or they're going to do it?
Tony, or I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question.
I might take a crack at it.
Okay, go for it, Marissa.
If it's a plant that's designated for control, there are some options through the Noxious Weed Control Board. But it does come down to a little bit of desire to use those options or not. So, I mean, I think you can set it as a goal with the recognition that if there's an unwilling landowner, it may or may not be worth the, effort to have more extreme options. And there have been some negative scenarios of the Noxious Weed Control Board conflicting with landowners. So I don't think we'd probably want to implement those, but I think you can still set it as a goal and work as best as possible to try and work with landowners, especially if they're going to be able to have free, if we can offer free assistance in removing those plants.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very much an educational thing where you try to make citizens understand how that benefits them as well as others to do it. But if they refuse to cooperate, there's no legal mandate that allows a mandate to mandate that they do it. So if they don't want to, they won't. So that's where education and communication within the community is very important.
Allison, do you want to say something real quick? You're on mute.
Okay, I'm curious because there's at least 2 homeowners on Tulloch Road who like it and want to keep it. And I know it's been banned in Europe where you have to disclose if you sell a piece of property that you actually have it on your property. We have people right next door that have it. Fortunately, they want to eradicate it, but it's starting to show up on our property. So for those homeowners who don't want it on their property and keep getting it because the other homeowners do it, what's the ramification? What can they do?
I think that's something we have to discuss with the Noxious Weed Control Board staff.
Yeah, and there are designations, and again, I know enough to maybe get myself in trouble, but there are designations of certain weeds by the Noxious Weed Control Board, and I can't remember if knotweed, is it a class A, class B? Like you must control?
It's class B, and it is designated for control in Snohomish County.
Yeah. At this point, I would like to hand it off to Tony, and she's going to kind of walk you through the general overview of the control methods that we looked at and considered. All of these methods must be reviewed per the ecology guidance manual that we have to follow to write this plan. But that doesn't mean, even though they might show up on this table that Tony's going to show you, that doesn't mean that we're pushing a method. It's just required that we consider it. And some of them are a good fit for Lake Roesiger, some of them are not. And so the red text in the next slide are those control methods that we, in our professional opinion, would be the best and most suitable for Lake Roesiger. And so with that, I will hand it over to Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, as Shannon mentioned, the guidance requires that we give a good review of these different types of controls that are listed in the left. And the specific methods can vary within those types of control groups. And so it kind of, you know, some of the nomenclature, the language about it gets a little bit convoluted and overlapping, because you can have, for example, you know, diver assisted hand pulling, but then you can have diver assisted suction, or dash, which is a term that I imagine several of you have heard before, but if you haven't, I'll be using the word dash a lot. So you can have diver hand pulling where they're using scuba, they're using equipment, but they're hand pulling, and then you can use a suction to then get that plant material back to the boat. And sometimes I think that ought to go into a different category because you're using some mechanics, but it typically falls out under manual. But again, anything that's in red are ones that we felt could go to the next level, either based on the plant species that are at the lake or water depth. There were a number of factors that went into it. For example, well, let's see, like with the different aquatic herbicides, for example, there are some that we just felt weren't, even though they could control some or maybe even all of the plants that are at the lake, we just didn't feel they were appropriate. We felt that there might be some community opposition to their use. So we really tried to target ones that had a better toxicity profile, for example. And then we avoided some devices that would be too disruptive to the sediment or just spread fragments, for example. So this is just sort of the overview, and I kind of wanted to jump into what does some of this look like, because when we talked last time, I feel like we spent a lot more time on the biology of the plants, and I mentioned some of these, but I didn't really, in my opinion, I don't know if you walked away with a sense of what it looks like. You can go to the next slide, thanks. So there's a lot of information here, but we kind of wanted to give you an idea of what permits are involved for these different types of controls. So with regard to, I'm doing what Shannon's doing, which is rotating on different slides here. So for the manual and mechanical approaches, which I'll go over first, you know, some of these things, you know, to manage it on your own property, for example, as long as you're not using an herbicide, a permit is maybe not needed. But for something like a barrier, you have to go with what's Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife refers to as the pamphlet. And the pamphlet serves a hydraulic project approval, or an HPA. And I understand that you guys have gone through this process for some barriers. It lists very specific controls that you can use and be covered under the HPA. And again, it just addresses the physical and mechanical. It does not include grass carp herbicides or any kind of dyes, which dyes sometimes are used to shade. You might see it in a golf course pond or something, but they'll shade plants or algae. The full-on HPA is required for larger removal projects. If it's not covered under the pamphlet, you go for the HPA. And this includes dredging and even log placement or repositioning, because I've heard some talk about where the logs are could interfere with some types of controls. But to get this HPA, it's not quite as simple as going through the pamphlet. You have to come up with some pretty detailed plans and specs, work plans, your plans and specs for fish protection, go through the SEPA checklist, and then there's a time review policy from WDFW for the HPA. So just, you know, I think a lot of this is probably not new to you guys, but just recognizing there are different types of permits for the different actions. So next slide. So I'll jump right in, no pun intended, with our manual. I'm watching the text pop up, sorry. Somebody interrupt me if we need to talk about a chat right now, or we can save it for later. So for manual, which I'm calling the hand pulling or cutting, I'm looking at this as more a non-diver. So this is really going to be more applicable to certain plant species. So with every one of these methods, I'm going to try and talk about which plants they target, some of their applications or their advantages, and then some of the disadvantages. So that'll be a kind of a common theme through these. So we are thinking Slender Arrowhead, not really well rooted, probably not too difficult to pull up by hand. I'm hearing from Marissa that there's been some, surprising to me, some pretty good success with Fragrant water lily with a lot of diligence, just using hand pulling. So this is really more applicable to small stands that are easy to pull. but all reproductive plant parts have to be removed. So if it's something that it spreads by seed, for example, yellow iris, got to make sure you get those out. The Eurasian milfoil, slender arrowhead, all of these, it's important to get these all reproductive parts pulled out. The good thing is it is highly selective. Until the water gets too mucked up, you can actually see what you're pulling up. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been some evidence at the lake for pretty good water lily removal, but with repeated cutting and then over multiple years. And one of the things that I think the education component will include is emphasizing that landowners can cut flowers and seed heads to at least prevent that mechanism of spread. And looking at that, it's really pretty minimal if this is a non-diver approach, minimal market, or excuse me, equipment. But you know, if you don't do it yourself, you're relying on what we're referring to as a market labor cost for a contractor. So we've kind of been a little dodgy about assigning a specific dollar amount to that, because it really depends. You could be hiring the local Boy Scouts or, you know, a contracted diver. So it's pretty broad. Unfortunately, it is time consuming. It does take repeated effort, just like pulling weeds in your yard. Again, you have to remove all the plant parts, and you're really at the whim of that market labor cost. So next, I mentioned diver assisted suction harvesting, or DASH. We've looked at and talked to a number of folks about what this might be most applicable to for you guys. And certainly Eurasian water milfoil, or EWM, we're going with that. Slender Arrowhead and fragrant water lily is on this list. However, there are a limited number of contractors willing to use DASH on that particular plant. So obviously some applications and advantage, you can remove the entire plant, especially as long as the diver has good visibility. And plants can be removed around obstacles like logs and docks. Unfortunately, it has a pretty high cost compared to herbicides, and it in many cases, especially probably with fragrant water lily, you're looking at a pretty small area within season. And I sort of alluded to this. It really depends on the availability of a contractor to remove certain plants. Some may be more willing to work with something like milfoil or arrowhead as opposed to fragrant water lily. And then for lily control, all these rhizomes have to be cut, which adds another layer of labor intensity. So, next slide. Actually, can you go back a second? I pulled this image off the web. I don't know how well you can see it here of what this sort of looks like, where a person is holding kind of almost a vacuum, pulling the plants up. And the good thing is they can sort of hold it above the plants, follow the stem down to the root, and then use their hands to pull up as much as they can. And it just gets sucked up onto the boat. So I don't know if you guys had seen what that looks like, but that was a pretty good image of that. Next slide. So hydraulic dredging is something that we heard from folks that they would be interested because, well, it targets pretty much every problem plant you have in the lake. It has the added benefit of not just removing those plants, but the sediment buildup that everyone is obviously concerned with. And then it opens up channel depth. Some of the major, the major issue with hydraulic dredging is it's extremely expensive. It also requires a fair bit of area to dispose of and dewater the sediments that are pulled out. So, for example, roughly 3 feet of sediment that's removed over an acre of sediment in the lake requires about 2 acres of upland area just to dewater it. And again, this also has the problem of potentially running into some submersed objects to limit where it can work. Next slide. And one thing that we did consider also are mechanical, especially with regard to fragrant water lily. So there are, the slide said for pulling rhizomes need to be cut. Does this, what can, I'm going to read this chat really quick. Does this mean you cut them down? They still need to be removed. The question is, on the last slide for fragrant water lily, on pulling rhizomes, do they need to be cut? Does this mean you just cut them or remove them? And yeah, they do need to be removed. So that adds another layer to that process. So mechanical harvesters come in all kinds of flavors. If you Google this, you will come up with just about every homespun item you can even imagine. I've seen some pretty crazy things out there. So their size varies quite a bit. The idea is that we won't just cut it. but also remove it. That's where the harvester component comes from. And so the way you get there is also accomplished in many different ways with these different machines. Some of the applications and advantage is it'll clear a channel. So if the mission is to keep that center navigation open, you know, you're basically mowing the whole, you know, whatever portions you want to get to. Unfortunately, by harvesting, you can also, it's not specific in any way, shape, or form. So if you run one of these over a bed of milfoil, unless you have 100% removal of fragments, and there have actually been studies on how many fragments get away from these things, you know, the milfoil simply has to be removed before a harvester goes over it. The availability of a harvester locally could be a bit challenging, and the investment to buy one is pretty steep on the front end, and then there's maintenance and operation. Again, you run into an issue of obstacles like logs and shallow water and docks, of course. And again, it requires a pretty frequent operation. Next slide. So with permitting and licensing for a chemical, which in this case we're referring to aquatic herbicides, a couple of things that we get asked are, well, can I go to Home Depot and buy something? But the fact is, in every state, only an aquatic formulation of an herbicide can be used in or near water. So, for example, products like glyphosate they have multiple labeling, and that labeling can apply to a terrestrial application or aquatic. And there are a number of other products that have started off with a terrestrial label, and then there were some modifications to the formulation, and then it received a label. And when I say that, it's a EPA approved label. It's gone through these different trials, and so they have to be labeled for this, and they can only be purchased and applied by a licensed herbicide applicator. In this, and this is important, it has to be within the state of Washington. They have to have an aquatic endorsement. So you can have someone that applies herbicide in terrestrial environments, and some of those will have an aquatic endorsement. And I see this in a lot of forestry situations because they're treating weeds right down to the riparian zone. So a number of folks that apply herbicides in the forestry world will have that aquatics endorsement. So to do an application in the state of Washington, Ecology has what's called the Aquatic Plant and Algae Management General Permit, and that applies to in-water and shoreline noxious weeds and even native nuisance plants and algae. And you have to have this particular permit for any plants that are in water or where that product could go into the water if you did a shoreline treatment. And it does require public comment, and it requires notification to lake residents. That's all part of the permit. And the specific signage, when you put the signs out, what the signs say is all in the permit. It's riveting reading. So if anybody wants, I'll send them a link, and you can check that out. But just see, it does give you a good sense of what the requirements are. So I'm going to go through.
Tony, can I jump in real quick?
Please.
And we really wanted to kind of hone in on the point, and this will come in with the shoreline plants, is a homeowner cannot apply an herbicide to any shoreline plant where there could be any potential for overspray into the water. So so if you had a stand of purple loosestrife or yellow flag iris on your property, you cannot apply an aquatic herbicide to that plant. You have to hire a licensed herbicide applicator. So
yes, thank you, Shannon. I would also add to that an individual homeowner cannot go get a permit. The water body is what is permitted, and then there is an applicant that is sort of the owner, or the I'm forgetting the word I'm looking for. So an individual homeowner can't just go get a permit. They would piggyback onto the larger permit. So I don't want to speak out of turn on behalf of the county, but hypothetically, if they held the permit, then that applicator would go through that particular applicant, if that makes sense. So it's not just that you can't go do it because of that, or because of what Shannon said, but it's also because there's only one permit that covers the water body.
And Just to clarify too, for Allison, I think in particular, if people have knotweed on their property that's not by the water, herbicides are an option. You can go to Lowe's and buy an herbicide because you don't need the aquatic formulation if you're away from the water.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question along those lines though. So where the Japanese knotweed is right next door to us is right next to a stream as well, up on the road.
So yeah, that'd be an issue. And the county does have, and Noxious Weed Control Board does have a permit to be able to treat near waterways. It's a little bit separate than this one. So they would be able to treat in those areas, just for clarification.
I muted myself. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to run through a series of aquatic herbicides that we as the team here have come to the conclusion are the best options for the plants at the lake. I want to be really clear that there are still a number of products that are available, and they might do the same trick, but we were looking for ones that, again, we thought would have a better profile and just be more favorable to the community at large. So just know that we did vet through a number of different products, and you know, if somebody feels like they've got a better solution, we should talk about it. But you know, aquatic plants really don't have an arsenal of products to go after them like terrestrial plants. So in fact, there's only something like 22 aquatic herbicides that have an aquatics label. So it's kind of a small number compared to terrestrial, which is like an order of magnitude more, like 200. So I just kind of want to put that out there. But for each one, I've listed the name of the chemical. This is the only one where I'm mentioning a trade name, because the trade name for this particular herbicide is Procelicor, and this fluoropyroxene benzyl, it's the only label that carries this particular chemistry. A lot of the others, there are multiple herbicide labels. So like Imazimox is clear cast, and they've got 2 or 3 other ones that go along with it. But at the end of the day, the EPA label for each of those is really quite similar. They just have different manufacturers. So so this is the only one where I'm putting a particular brand, and I want to be clear, it's not an endorsement. It's just the only game in town for that particular chemistry. So Procelicor is a systemic herbicide. It's very specific to, it targets Eurasian water milfoil. And I'm finding evidence that it could potentially target Slender Arrowhead and possibly even Fragrant water lily. I say potentially because these 2 plants are not on Procelicor's label as being specific to their management. And when you go to one of these labels, it typically will list, okay, this product is good for submerged species, this one's good, or these emergent species. It has them all broken down. And that doesn't mean it won't affect something else, but these are just ones that have gone through trials. And so Slender Arrowhead and Fragrant water lily, I don't believe show up at, well, I know Arrowhead does not show up on the label, but I don't think Fragrant water lily does either. So again, some of the applications and advantages, it's highly specific to Eurasian water milfoil. It has, again, a highly favorable human health and environmental toxicity profile. And I know this is a lot to read at the bottom, but, and this is in the plan, these human health risks and environmental risks and mitigation measures are all in the plan that you could look at a little bit closer. But I just kind of wanted to provide that information. A lot of this comes from ecology. They did a supplemental environmental impact statement whenever they reissued the permit. And so for a number of these chemistries, they reevaluated the human health or environmental risks. So so that's there for you to kind of glance at now, but again, it's in the plan that Marissa sent out. So some of the disadvantages with this particular chemistry for your situation is that it's very specific to milfoil, but the milfoil density is currently quite low. So it might not be worth the effort to target milfoil with this particular product. However, if it's effective on Slender Arrowhead, then I think that's a game changer for managing the arrowhead population, which would really make ecology happy in terms of managing this plant so it wouldn't spread to other lakes. Next slide. Oh, can you go back one more? So the next one I want to talk about is Imazipure. It's a broad spectrum systemic herbicide, so it's far less specific to any one plant that you have in the lake. One appealing part of this is when I say it's an alternative to glyphosate, I mean in the sense of how many target plants it will treat. But on the flip side of glyphosate, it has a much more favorable human health and environmental toxicity profile. And it's more effective. I shouldn't say it's more effective. I should have just said it's effective for controlling large areas. The one of the disadvantages, it is, again, it's not selective. So it does go for a number of other desirable natives and maybe even ornamentals. Of course, this may be less of an issue at a monoculture of lilies. And it does persist in soil and can damage some terrestrial trees. So you have to be mindful of how it binds to the sediment in those terrestrial areas. And there are some irrigation restrictions. I'm not going to go into those, but I know that there are some irrigation withdrawals, and each of these products has a different restriction, and it can be found in the label. And it's usually something like it has to be non-detect to a certain level after a certain amount of time. And you would be posted about that. So just letting you know that it is there. Okay, go ahead, sorry. Imazimox, I know these names are confusing because they're quite alike. It's also a broad spectrum, but fewer target plants, in this case, the knotweeds and yellow flag iris. So it can control submerged weeds, but it's typically used more often with these emergents. It also has pretty favorable human health and environmental toxicity profile. It's also highly mobile in the soil, but it persists for less time than Imazipure. And in a number of instances, these are actually put together in a tank mix. And sometimes you'll see Imazimox or Imazipure with glyphosate, or there are ways applicators might view the system and make a call on the best way to make these applications. So I'm not getting into the details of how that should occur. I just want to present like the suite that we're considering. So next slide. And then the triclopyr is another one that I've used in a number. Harry and I have used it at a number of sites for milfoil. It's selective. It's also systemic, pretty specific to milfoil, really. And again, given the size of the infestations, this may or may not be the best tool. For the applications, if it's targeting loosestrife, it's important to consider anyway doing the treatment when flowers are really visible, because if you treat too early, you could mix up the purple loosestrife with other natives, and then you might end up with some impacts to some desirable natives that you didn't intend. And kind of the bonus, I put this under advantage, is that there's evidence that it could impact lilies as well, but not enough to call it a substantial treatment, in my opinion. It also has a favorable human health and environmental toxicity profile. Sorry, reading the chats again. And I already mentioned its potentially impacts to desirable natives. Next slide. And lastly, bottom barriers, which I understand you guys might be pretty familiar with these. The advantage is it can eradicate small areas. It takes a lot of maintenance to use that word eradication. I mean, that's a big word that's very difficult to achieve, but so when you say eradication, it might just be under your dock, just to be clear. And we're really only advocating it for these small areas like docks and swimming areas. It can be installed by landowners, but a lot of people choose to have divers come in and maintain them and flip them. Some of the disadvantages, they can be damaged by props. The fact that they only treat small areas is a problem for some. Maintenance is definitely significant. I've seen 2 of my projects where they didn't make it the year, not even 1 year, because they got covered in sediment. So, and there's some restrictions through the pamphlet on the area that can be covered. Next slide. I think that's all I had on that. I tried to go pretty quickly, but do we want to have any discussion on that, or what?
Well, I think so. We're running about 5 minutes behind our allotted time, and I would really like to be able to devote some time to talking about these different management alternatives and control options for the lake. And so I think if there are some questions about a specific control option that we can talk about them as we go through the tables. That might be the best way to kind of keep the process moving forward. So, so we've now arrived at kind of the meat of the whole meeting. We are going to kind of run through the management alternatives and control options for the lake by plant species. And these are the tables that were in the plan. Again, they're supposed to be labeled 8-4. I don't know exactly what they were labeled, but they're the big tables at the end of the plan. And one thing we kind of wanted to introduce was the idea of adaptive management. So with all of these plans, the community and the committee are going to have to be flexible. These control options that we have put forth are based on the plant community in July of 2021. And so we all know that nature can throw all kinds of wrenches at us at any point in time. And so you can get a plan done and you can get a plan approved by ecology, which is the ultimate, is what we're striving for. And then come next spring, you could have a completely different set of plants. And so, and that's all built in. So you want to, these tables have a lot of information in them, but that's on purpose so that you can come back to your plan and be like, well, all of a sudden, all of our slender arrowhead is gone and we only have a small patch. And so let's change our goal to eradication and let's get rid of it. I mean, that likely won't happen, but we just want to make sure that you understand that nature has a way of surprising us, and that there will be moments where you will have to adapt and change the way that you go through the management options. And so as we go through the different plants, you'll probably notice that we're starting with the easiest ones first, and then we're going to hit the fragrant water lily last, because we kind of want to kind of get the process going and show you have you become familiar with how the tables look. And then Jen has set up several polls within Zoom, and we will ask you to vote on the various management goals and control options. And for purposes of the polls and what we want to then take forward and recommend to the community as an option to consider, we were thinking 60% would be our goal. So if 60% of the steering committee voted for option 1 for a plant species, then we would then revise the plan to show the community that was the committee's recommendation. Did I miss anything, Tony, Marissa, Barry?
I think the other piece is if the committee doesn't come to an agreement, it's okay too. It just means there won't be a recommendation from the committee on which option the community should choose.
Yeah, and these tables in their entirety, and there might be some adjustments made after this meeting this evening, the community will see those. These will always live in the plan. It's just going to be whether the far right-hand column says committee recommendation or not recommended for further consideration. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll start off with Eurasian water milfoil, and I will let Tony take it back over.
Yeah, so this is a lot to take in, and I like that you guys both said that even though we have a recommendation, which in this case is indicated by bold, and this isn't just us, this was really a lot of, this one is the easy one, this is the low-hanging fruit, because this was something that came out of the poll that we gave you guys too, is that, eradicating milfoil seems like a realistic goal. Now, we in order to accomplish that goal, we have to come up with a suite of options. And just because an option is listed, and I think Marissa just said this too, doesn't mean we have to do it. But I think it's worth noting that, let's say the goal is to eradicate milfoil. Well, that again is based on what we saw in 2021. If for some reason the committee or the community at large decided, no, we don't want to pursue that in 2022, well, that changes the situation. And so now we might need to rely on different management options to accomplish that goal. I think if we get to a point where we're unwilling to invoke one of those management options, then we need to adjust our goals because some of the options simply won't get us there. And so I think it's worth having that reality check and managing our expectations about what we can get with the options available. And then it gets to the obvious of what's it going to cost. So it starts with the tool based on current situation, and then sometimes the cost is the one that puts us over the edge. So again, we're starting with sort of the easier one. So if the management goal is to eradicate milfoil, we're looking at 2 different approaches to get there. And based on the surveys, it sounds like looking at diver hand pulling might not be too unrealistic, which I don't get to say that very often with milfoil. And we put some costs to this, and I know this is a lot of information to take in, and I don't want to read every word for word here, but I wanted to kind of give you the overview of how we landed on some of this. So based on our work in managing milfoil and other lakes, we have some idea of how much it costs to do these different treatments. And for the remaining milfoil infestations, remind me again, Marissa, wasn't it like combined less than an acre?
It's less than 0.2 acres.
Yeah, so we're not talking about a very large area. So we're not looking at a lot in the way of chemical, but you still do have to pay an applicator to deploy, to be on site, to do the work. So those costs might not change too much.
Did you mean diver, Tony? You said applicator.
I'm sorry, I meant manual. Sorry, thank you.
Oh, okay.
I was looking at the next line, sorry. So yes, sorry. Based on our experience looking at these different methods, we kind of came, that's how we came to the conclusion with these different numbers. So the preliminary costs and assumptions are based on the information from other lakes, but then we sort of tried to pull that out over a 5-year period. And these are some big ranges, but you have to remember it incrementally will go down over time as well. So we kind of penciled that out. If we start off on the high end and reduce over time. So in this case, as I said earlier, we were recommending Priscillacor if a chemical application would be needed. And that pencils out to about $800 or $1,000 an acre. And there I see now it's just down to 0.2 acres. So in this particular one, we recommended for further consideration. Now that's our recommendation. The other management goal could just be to reduce the current coverage in the lake and to prevent further spread, which is basically the status quo, because the divers are doing hand pulling once every 1 to 3 years. There's some idea of what that costs, but so this would just be a maintenance operation. So we aren't really recommending that for further consideration, because this is kind of a unique situation where you may actually be able to eradicate milfoil. This would be desirable to ecology. And so that's how we landed on this recommendation. So Jen, unless there's anything else from the team to chime in, I think, or any questions, maybe Jen wants to run the poll.
I think we should see if there's any questions about.
Yeah, any discussion?
I'm seeing a lot pop up in the chat, so I don't know if it's related to what I'm talking about though.
One thing I should mention too is we base the diver costs on what our divers that we use at Goodwin and Jewcraft are, and I know you hire divers too. I think I have that in the range correctly, but if you think these estimates are way off for the diving, what it will take time-wise and money-wise, please let me know. And Melanie, by the way, thank you for your very specific feedback on the plan in terms of the community inputs. We'll add those in. And Lena's just joining us now, so we're all here now. Yay.
Okay. So if there's, oh, we do have a hand. Michelle. You're muted, Michelle.
Okay, there's some questions on the chat board there regarding our own divers, and yes, we are experimentally trying with some divers, and I don't know, Marissa, if you've been informed yet, but they went out last Sunday in that one little area where there was a few plants. They did pull those, and did Christine talk to you about it yet?
A message has been received.
I talked to Alex about it, but yeah, so if not everybody else is aware, they have volunteer divers go out and pick the plants we found in the survey, which is so awesome.
Yeah, and I know that Christine can give you way more information on that, but regardless of whether or not we do have hand pullers pulling out little pieces as we can, we will still need to have, I at least believe we would still need to have a company come out and do extensive diving to do mapping and make sure that we're getting everything. And that would have to happen every few years or so. So some people thinking that we could just handle it by ourselves, I don't think that's the way to think. I think that we'd still need professionals and to just make sure that we are on top of it and keeping it out and that kind of stuff. So it can't all be handled at the lake level, although I think they did a phenomenal job last Sunday. So, and thanks you guys, I appreciate it.
A message has been received.
And I believe Christine, your hand is up as well. You're also muted.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think the team did a really good job. We were basically, we had the materials that Marissa sent out to us about how to safely hand pull and eradicate the plants. And we watched YouTube videos, and we were familiar with what the plants look like and the importance of getting the entire plant and not letting it fragment. And both Chris and Nathan used small mesh nets to put over the plant and then scoop it out from underneath, gathering up all the roots, and to tightly hold on to that bag and bring it up to the surface to us. And I think we collected well over 30 plants. And I think, you know, the importance of doing this, at least since Marissa and Jen found this on their plant survey, was to try to remove those plants before they had a chance to fragment over the fall and winter and create new plants. So I think it worked really well as a kind of a backup follow-up to this. And hopefully if homeowners see any milfoil in between surveys, that's something that we could hopefully address and tackle so that we get on it promptly before if we do a commercial or professional survey.
So, and I feel like I have to say this as a county representative, just to clarify, the county risk office would not allow us to be part of any sort of diving effort or anything. So this is a completely community driven thing, which is great. And so again, we super appreciate it. And I also just wanted to say hi to Lena. Thanks for joining. We'll try and get you caught up as we go. And I also wanted to point out, it looks like Jim Blankenbeckler, our manager in surface water, is also here, just if you're wondering who the extra person is, it looks like. So welcome to you both.
And we have Allison, your hand is up.
I have a question just about milfoil. Can it grow in between the lily pads that are out there?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, very much so.
No.
Oh, go ahead, Tony. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I mean, and that's one thing to consider. It can grow. Now, whether it is growing there, you know, based on the surveys, I have to look at the maps, but milfoil can grow in surprisingly low light levels. So it can capture some of the sunlight that's, you know, coming in between the lily pad leaves themselves. So I would not rest my laurels, so to speak, on it being shaded out or anything.
I can speak to that a little from our days when surface water was doing diving. I've been out there with the divers, and we have seen some milfoil growing on the edges of the lily pad patches. The divers went back in there pretty extensively as far as they could. with equipment, but very rarely did they find anything ever beyond the first foot or so of lilies. So that was encouraging. I think the other factor at play here is the Sagittaria. It is one of the reasons that we think anecdotally is why milfoil hasn't gotten worse here. There probably is some level of suppression occurring from the Sagittaria as well, preventing it from spreading in those areas because it is so dense in the middle basin. So it's the one good thing about the Slender invasive.
I'd just like to add a little diversity in Long Lake, for instance, where we have a patch of 30 to 35 acres in one zone of the lake of fragrant lily. When we started management years, a couple decades ago, Eurasian water milfoil was about 20% of that area had Eurasian water milfoil, even though it was totally covered by the lilies and dominated. And so it depends on the lake, whether there's all sorts of situations, not just the light, it's the sediment, the soil, and other things that allow the spread of the fragments to get a root down and stay. So a lot of things going on. Sometimes you see it in the little pads and sometimes you don't. And also, like Ballinger, we found that Eurasian water milfoil was in between the fragrant lily.
Okay, now I think it's time to ask the question. So I will launch this poll. So this is Eurasian water milfoil management question 3. Which management goal for Eurasian water milfoil should the committee recommend? Management goal 1, eradicate the remaining small infestations, or 2, containment with diver hand pulling. So please vote now. I'll give you a few seconds. Jim, don't vote. Please.
And on that note, just so you know, we are not voting either. So
okay, it looks like everyone has voted, so I will end the poll and share the results. So it looks like 58% voted for goal 1 and 42 for goal 2. Okay. Back to you, Tony.
Okay, next slide, please.
Tony, I think because this is the first poll, I think it might be helpful, or Shannon, to talk about what the implication of that vote is.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. You know, Shannon kind of mentioned earlier that if we don't get an overwhelming majority, and I believe we said 66% would be kind of the cutoff, then these would be goals that would be carried forward, but they wouldn't have the endorsement from the steering committee. So so they'll still be presented, but it won't necessarily have your blessing when it goes to the community. Was that right, Shannon? 66%?
Yeah, we had said 60%. So the engineer in me wants to round 58 up, but I won't. So go ahead, Marissa.
No, you go.
So we had talked about earlier in the plan, in the presentation for the community, that we would have a couple of columns in this table. One, the steering committee recommendation column that says, you know, which one, and we could probably include these voting results in that column of that table. And then we also would have a column that is our recommendation based on our experience and professional judgment. And then that way the community has a lot of information, and then they can then vote on what option maybe they would like to see. Is that right, Marissa? Did I get it?
Yep. So what my understanding is, based on that vote, that neither of these would have the community recommendation, is what we've decided here.
Committee recommendation.
Committee.
Which is totally fine. Absolutely fine. That is why we ask. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's move on to, we had to split out, we can go to the next slide. We split out the shoreline species into knotweed and purple loosestrife, and then the yellow flag iris, because we really couldn't make their goals didn't line up quite as well as seamlessly. So with the invasive knotweed and purple loosestrife, we landed on 3 potential management goals. The recommendation, kind of like milfoil, the populations are so small, relatively speaking, to say slender pondweed or fragrant water lily, is that it could be that eradication is an option using a highly integrated approach. Now, eradication, I think I mentioned with milfoil, it's highly unlikely you're going to get there with just one tool in your toolbox. So for knotweed and purple loosestrife, we're looking at advocating for manual, should be some hand pulling, digging, and covering. Also with the use of chemical, in this case, imazapyr and triclopyr, although the triclopyr will be more applicable to loosestrife. So again, though, it's not to say that both of these have to happen, but they're tools in the toolbox if that's your goal. So the big question here is always, if you don't like the goal, we need to, or you don't like the tools that will get you to the goal, maybe we need to reevaluate that goal. But based on what the 2021 survey showed us, this seems like a potential prize to go for. So again, with the manual portion, we're looking more at market labor costs, but also maybe leaning on volunteers and residents. We started talking about that a bit ago. It is extremely difficult just using manual approaches, though. So that's why we've sort of added this chemical approach to the toolbox as well. Looking at roughly $800 to $1,000 an acre. This is not getting at the question we had earlier about private residences where it's away from the water. So this is really looking more at applications that are near water, near the lake or near the creek, the stream that was mentioned earlier. And we talked about how this could be a great community-wide effort, everybody kind of getting on board together. And because of its status, there is potential for assistance from the Snohomish County Noxious Weed Board. This is for knotweed. And then for so we're considering this one, this is our recommendation to consider further. The second option, or excuse me, goal, is to more just reduce the current coverage along the shoreline and prevent further spread. So again, it would be really the same options for how the management would occur, but it's just sort of scaling back the intensity of how those two options are implemented. So sorry, let me get this off. So for loosestrife, we can advocate that residents do things like cut flowers to prevent any further spread that way. And then, there could be some chemical controls, but again, we want to prioritize any expanding populations. So, we're scaling back from eradication to just sort of keep it where it is. But then we've got this third option that I don't think has come up with the other plants, where it's just really status quo and do nothing. I mean, that's always an option, or do nothing without, sorry, these chats are distracting me. Maybe the status quo of no action is something until, it gets tabled for later, but our feeling is that if you've got these different options available that have been fairly well vetted, then when you're ready to reach for that particular tool based on community, sentiment or how the populations are expanding, because again, like with something like this, it's based on what we're seeing from 2021. So if nothing happened for a couple of years, eradication either may not be an option or it would go up significantly. So, and I saw a chat pop up about costs and, the manual and hand pulling and all this. I mean, a lot of these questions about how much does it cost gets into how it's done. Like, is it a homeowner or is somebody hiring a contractor? I mean, these are really different dollar amounts to talk about. I mean, the herbicides we can nail down a little bit better because we've either done the work or, as Marissa has mentioned, there may be some funds based on its listing from the Noxious Weed Board. So this is where yes.
We do have a hand up, Allison. And I just want to remind everyone with costs, these are preliminary costs. These are not final costs. You're not signing up to pay this. This is just kind of your off the cuff cost so that you can have an idea. Allison, would you like to ask your question?
It's my understanding with the Japanese knotweed that we've got, if you start to cut it or try to hand pull it, the roots will grab into the soil and go down twice as deep as what they normally would have. So, and I've seen that on 2 different studies, and I'd be happy to forward those, but I hate to say it, but it sounds like herbicides might be one of the best options for that. And if you go into Monroe or into Snohomish, there's huge fields of Japanese knotweed you can see right now. That particularly in Monroe, where they've been trying to get rid of it, Snohomish County has, and they've been trying for over 10 years and it's still there. So that's the scary part.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I feel like when the infestations of some of these weeds are manageable, it's you kind of have to take advantage of it before it becomes so unmanageable that that's what is in, covers the lake. I've seen so many lakes that have yellow flag iris, around the entire band. And so, and I'm sure you all have too. Notice on here under manual, there's also the covering. So, maybe that's where in small areas, that might be a way to, again, bring in an integrated approach to deal with some of those stems or roots that are popping back up. So I don't think with this eradication, if we're going for eradication, it's not just going to be one thing. It'll have to be multiple tools.
David also has his hand up.
Yeah, all I wanted to do is to comment that, earlier in our conversation this evening, Harry had mentioned that sometimes there's an advantage in leaving strong language in our goals in the IAVMP in terms of having a better position when it comes to grant writing and such. And so I don't know if you want to continue to comment on that as we are doing our voting, where sometimes a goal that might be unrealistic can be a good thing. So anyways, and I saw also in the chat that Michelle Reamer said, let's vote again. And I think that just my sense is that in our voting, these are really complicated issues, and it may be that many of us would change our minds quickly and easily with comments like the one that I just mentioned.
And again, voting doesn't mean that we're taking it out. These will still be in the plan. It just means that you did not come to a consensus. And so it's not steering committee recommended. So that's the distinction.
So I think that's a good point, and it makes me wonder if we should revisit the milfoil or not. So I think we should table that till we're done with this conversation. But I did want to speak to, there's a lot of questions about the costs associated with this. And I think the reason that we in part didn't include costs for this is we had a sense from the last community meeting that the community didn't really necessarily have an appetite or interest in spending kind of grant and community dollars to address some of these lower priority plants on the shoreline if there were other ways to do that. So that's why in these options, we're mostly seeing that it's kind of up to the individual landowner. And what's not shown in these control tables is the education piece, which I think Allison and others have really stressed is probably going to be the key to these. So in a lot of ways, the education is going to lead to these people doing the work themselves, the market contractor, other things. The one exception to that is the potential for assistance from the Noxious Weed Control Board. And like Allison points out, in particular, knotweed is a very difficult one to control without herbicides. I can speak from personal experience of buying a foreclosed home with a field of knotweed. It is super hard to get rid of, and it takes a lot of effort. And so this is one place where, if this is a goal of the community and is a high priority, we can see if there's potential for that. And, in order to be successful. So I think the other thing in there too is there had been some talk of the community coming together and having volunteers go help landowners that might not be able to do it. And I don't know if that's actually something the community is serious about or not. So that's why we left it somewhat vague, either market or volunteer resident. So if there is interest in the community doing that, we would need to kind of know that so we could spell that out more clearly in the plan.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, I guess I will launch this poll. And so this is for purple loosestrife and the knotweed management question 4. Which management goal for invasive knotweed and purple loosestrife should the committee recommend? Management goal number 1, management goal number 2, reduction, or management goal number 3, no action. I'll give a few more seconds. We have a few more people that need to vote. I think we're looking for 2 more votes, 1 more vote. Okay, and I will share the results. So it looks like 50% towards eradication, 25% towards reduction, and 25% towards no action. Okay, back to you, Tony.
Okay, so yellow flag iris.
Tony, should we revisit the Eurasian water milfoil now or maybe towards the end of the meeting?
I'm sorry, say it again.
It seems like there was a mention in the chat and both from that and David about revisiting milfoil. Did you want to actually do that now or later or?
It's fine to go ahead and do it now.
Yeah, I would suggest we do it now because I think as we get into the more complicated lily stuff, we're gonna get sidetracked.
Yeah.
Okay, let me relaunch the poll.
Can I say something first? So
yes,
I'm coming here with the perspective of the person that has to write the upcoming grant application for this project. And you can't structure everything perfectly, but later on, we're gonna talk about fundability of projects. Projects are going to be funded that address Class B noxious weeds. And Eurasian water milfoil is the highest priority noxious weed you've got on your list here. So if there's anything you're going to go for an eradication goal that you're going to include in your plan and be serious about, if you want to get the funding for the big piece, you're probably going to need to include it. So I don't like trying to influence decisions, but this is one where if you want to get grant money, it's probably a good idea to include it. So I don't know if that's overstating things too much, but.
Okay, are you ready for me to relaunch? Okay. Okay, back to Eurasian water milfoil. Which management goal for Eurasian water milfoil should the committee recommend? Management goal number 1, eradicate remaining small infestations, or management goal 2, containment with diver hand pulling. We're looking for 2 more people to vote. We'll share the results. So management goal number 1, eradication, has reached consensus. And I will stop sharing. Okay, so we can continue on, Tony.
Tony, you're on mute.
Sorry, well, I have a lot of activity going on in my house, so I'm trying to eliminate some interruptions. So yellow flag iris kind of fell out as one of the lower priority. We didn't, I think Shannon said we're not presenting these necessarily in the order that everyone saw them. At this point, we're kind of presenting them in the order of complexity. So we're going to start moving into more complexity after this one. But with yellow flag iris, it seemed like the consensus was that sort of a low level stand of yellow flag iris was maybe acceptable. So we went for the goal of reduce current coverage along lake shoreline to prevent further spread. And this one definitely relies on an integrated approach, but also more interaction with the community, because this is one where the community could be more involved, or individual landowners with manual cutting of seed pods and flowers, do some digging and removal. And, you know, as long as you're not laying a barrier, there's a lot of things you can do without having to worry about even HPA. Of course, if you get into doing any kind of a chemical, we get back into the permitting issue where you have to have a licensed, applicator and be covered under the permit. So this isn't necessarily a community portion, but some of the other, like the manual, both cutting and then the removal and covering, these are things that individual landowners in the community can be a part of. And what I'm kind of hearing is that maybe there's a volunteer group that helps educate landowners about how to implement these things. And so unfortunately, a lot of this comes out with sort of an unknown to be determined about cost, because the approach of how that's accomplished is quite different. But these options seem very relevant to meeting this particular goal for yellow flag iris. And then of course, there's a second goal of just the status quo of what's happening now, where there's whatever's already happening on individual landowners without, that additional push through education or a lake volunteer group, for example. So this one is actually pretty straightforward, I think, in terms of what to meet that goal. And I think the goal is realistic for goal 1 anyway. So
yeah, and Tony, can I add just one little thing?
Please.
And we probably should have said this many tables ago, but just because we have recommended for further consideration on that is tied with that management goal and not necessarily with a specific management option. So, but what we've given you is we think you should go after reducing the current coverage along the shoreline and prevent further spread. And then we've listed out the management options, and that could all be combined into an integrated approach that could get you there. But and I see this as I'm looking at the slide, and the red text lines up right with the herbicide part. So I just wanted to make sure that we're not saying that the herbicide part is the piece that we think should be moved for further consideration, but that the community should try and go after that management goal using whatever methods in the toolbox that are applicable. Does that make sense, Tony?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, because she's right. That really does relate back to that goal, and if we can realistically get there. It's not necessarily one of those individual management options. So, but you're right, that does line up perfectly, but it's just coincidental. So.
Okay, should we put it up for discussion? People are shaking their head now. Should I launch the poll to vote for this management goal? All right, launching poll. Okay, yellow flag Irish management goal, question number 5. Which management goal for yellow flag Irish should the committee recommend? Number 1, reduce infestation along the shoreline, or number 2, no action? Looking for one more vote, and then I will close the poll. Okay, it looks like 58% would like goal number 1 to reduce infestation along the shoreline, and 42% no action. Okay, back to you, Tony.
And I think, oh, go ahead, Tony.
I was going to say next slide. Go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, I think yellow flag iris is one of those plants, and there's a reason why it was one of the lower priority plants, is that there's so much of it, and it's so hard to control that the split between the two goals is not unexpected, I think. It's in lakes around here where I am in Spokane, it's everywhere. And it's daunting to try and think about how you would reduce coverage of that plant, in my opinion. I think it can be done. And I think even though the committee is not maybe coming to an overwhelming consensus, it's still part of the plan, and it can still be part of the education part. And you can still provide that information. So
Allison has her hand up too, before we move on.
I just want to say, I believe it was Marissa that put out some sort of an educational piece. Somebody did from Snohomish County about the invasive weeds, and neighbors on both sides of me spent time getting rid of the Japanese iris, or what the flag, the yellow iris. One of them spent the entire day pulling it out and weeding it and stuff. It's not hard to remove. And my mom, as an example, over on the North Lake, on the neck of the North Lake, has had it for ever since I was a little kid, and it didn't spread. So it's on Lake Roesiger, as far as I've seen, it's not horribly invasive. It's not like the lily pads. So I think education is going to be one of the key issues on that one.
Yeah, and that's what I'm seeing in the chat. There's a lot of really good conversation in the chat box regarding education. It seems like it's focused a lot towards the invasive knotweed, purple loosestrife, and now yellow iris. So that's really good to know. I mean, that wasn't a poll, but it's kind of coming out that way. So, okay, let's go to Slender Arrowhead. So this one I think is kind of interesting because it's not present in hardly, what is it, something like 5 lakes in the state of Washington. It doesn't seem to be a high priority for a lot of homeowners. It's probably not that intrusive to boating and other recreation activities, especially stacked up against fragrant water lily. And so this one was interesting to kind of shake out here, but we kind of came up with an incremental reduction. And when we say incremental, roughly 20% of surface acres each year over a 10-year period, but with the long-term goal of eradication. And again, anytime we're talking about eradication, we need to really be thinking about all the tools in the toolbox. It seems that manual approaches with Slender Arrowhead might be, especially if we're on a 10-year plan here, might be pretty realistic, because removing this particular plant using dash or diver hand pulling is probably a lot more simple and less logistically challenging compared to fragrant water lily. It also opens it up to more contractors who will do this work, because one thing we've learned is that not all contractors are willing to deal with, say, fragrant water lily. One of our concerns, though, is that if with this incremental reduction in Slender Arrowhead, there could be an increase in milfoil, because you're opening up habitat for that species. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, and maybe a good reason to make it more of an incremental approach. And so this is something we can put some rough numbers on for the dash approach. Chemical is, we have a little uncertain at this time, but I kind of alluded to this earlier, that there are a couple of products that I've found in the literature that have been used to target this species, even not just other species of arrowhead, because there are other Sagittaria species that tend to grow in riparian areas and shallow portions of littoral zone, but also rice fields. And so some of the early work on this genus is from Sagittaria in rice fields, and I found a study in Louisiana where it was on this particular species, and that's important because Slender Arrowhead doesn't tend to emerge as much as some of the other Sagittaria species, and by that I mean that some of the leaves are as exposed above the water, and that growth form opens up different herbicides that will target the plant. And when it's completely submerged, it's a bit of a game changer on what will and won't work. So I found a very compelling study about Priscillacor And I kind of mentioned that earlier. So I don't think that's off the table, but we also have to, we might get a twofer if we decided to go for, doing Percelicore treatment on the small patches of milfoil. We might get a secondary benefit of removing some of the Sagittaria, but that's a bit unknown at this point. So I'm not sure how ecology would, view you guys. This could be more of an experimental approach, really. So that's something to consider. But we felt that management goal was realistic for this plant. The second management goal is to, again, sort of leave it up to the individual landowners in front of their property, using just manual hand pulling methods. Again, relying on market costs, or go with the status quo of no action. And we felt that the incremental approach for goal 1, we do recommend that, and we did consider that further in the plan. And then same with individual landowners, consider that, but and then move forward with that consideration. But we're really, in our opinion, we feel that goal 1 is attainable, based on, especially if the chemical approach it turns out is viable.
And I think that this goes along with the thought, or the reason behind this is this plant isn't in a lot of lakes in the state of Washington, and there's some unknowns associated with its impacts to a lake ecosystem and lake health. And I think ecology would be looking for the community to kind of put some sort of reduction, or a goal towards eradication. Now, it could take 10, 15, 20 years, but I think that that would be something that ecology would be looking for, and with the secondary benefit of also keeping it out of other lakes. And is that kind of your thinking too, Marissa or Harry? I don't know much about this plant.
Yeah, I mean, this one is a little bit of a wild card in terms of how a priority it is. It's only in a handful of lakes in Snohomish County, and it has been spreading. It spread to like 2 more in the last decade, unfortunately. So there may even be options for experimental control outside of the standard ones that ecology might throw at this. So I think this goes to the bigger question I think Melanie brought up in the chat. We have all these lofty goals for all these plants, but then everything's going to cost a lot of money, right? So you can set your goals, and then you can develop the suite of options or the actual plan with the dollar values attached that you're going to prioritize those. So it's okay if you set a goal that you're going to try and reduce this over time, but this is a lower priority than the milfoil and the lilies and others. And so when you're going after your initial funding, you're going to go with what you can get of those. And then you layer down until you're out of funding. So so it is hard to kind of, I know it's frustrating because we're presenting you with kind of things very individually. I did prepare a table that kind of throws all of the recommendations that we've made and what those costs look like for a total, and then kind of broke it down of how much it would cost per property. That might help put things into context when we actually get to like what you're going to do. So if you're feeling frustrated by voting at this without having a full information, I get that. So I just apologize for it's hard to do in sequence, but I think there's also Alex maybe wanted to talk about this plant a little bit too. Sorry to put you on the spot, Alex, but.
Yeah, so I was just chowing down some dinner. Excuse me. Yeah, so Nathan has a Dash platform that he's built, and according to you, Marissa, extracting the slender leaf arrowhead is relatively easy using that type of system. So it might be hard, just hand pulling or whatever, extremely difficult because it's all underwater, obviously. But using the Dash, it should be pretty easy. But in order to get the grant, we should make this a priority. Vote yes on eradicating it. Try to get the money, and then once we get the money, we can kind of allocate the funding elsewhere where it's needed, but we can take care of this species by ourselves. And I'll volunteer to do it using the Dash with Nathan. That's all.
Ron has his hand up. Ron.
There we go. I'm unmuted. Yeah, and this one, I threw this into the chat, but realistically, this one would work better as say North and South Lake versus Middle Lake, because I would recommend strategy 1 for Middle Lake, but goal number 2 for North and South Lake. Because in Middle Lake, the arrowhead is essentially all the way into the channel. But on the North and South Lake, it's just that little bit in front of the homeowners.
I would just say that's true for some areas, especially where it drops off deeply, but in other areas in the North and South Basin, like near the boat launch, that entire cove is covered in it, as well as the entire cove by the park. So there are pretty extensive areas in the other. So not to say that's not a good idea to separate it out, but just there are areas that are quite dense.
Okay, are we ready to launch the next poll to vote? I'm assuming because Tony's muted. Okay, so
Sorry, I was
next
making a note.
poll. Which management goal for Slender Arrowhead should the committee recommend? Goal number 1, reduction 20% per year over 10 years. Goal 2, up to individual landowner, or goal 3, no action. I'm just waiting for 2 more people. Okay. So it looks like we have 58% for management goal 1 of reduction and 42% leave it up to the individual landowner. Okay, back to you, Tony.
Jen, can I ask you a quick question? Do these results get, like I've been trying to write down the numbers, but are these all saved? Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Okay, next slide. So we did land on separating out our management goals for Fragrant water lily between we kind of grouping the North and South basins, and then the Middle Basin is pulled out separately for reasons that Marissa kind of alluded to with the Slender Arrowhead. Obviously, the densities are very different, the needs are different, so we felt that made sense to separate out. So where Fragrant water lily is somewhat less dense, we may be able to have a management goal of eradication. The 2021 data indicate there's roughly 1.25 acres. So I thought later about whether or not the word eradication is appropriate for this scenario, because we still, there will be patches in the Middle Basin, because that's not a recommendation. We'll get to that in a second. Eradication is not, it's not a recommended goal anyway for the Middle Basin. So to say eradication of the North and South may be a bit misleading when there are known populations in the middle portion. But again, getting back to this, if we're going to push for eradication, we're going to need to have a few options up our sleeves. The first option listed here is a chemical treatment, which we kind of penciled out, treating that 1.25 acres a couple of times a year for about 3 years. In the literature seems to be about what's out there, and it's not terribly cost prohibitive. 3.5 to 7.5 over a 5-year period. That's just for the North and South basins again. The second option, which we really like, is the use of dash, and 1.25 acres doesn't sound that big, except when you put in the dash component, because again, I had a conversation with Nathan and got a sense of how much could be accomplished. And even though the use of dash, I think we all agree is still viable for managing Fragrant water lily, it probably wouldn't get us to eradication alone, based on just the availability of equipment and the contractor. And that's based on our current understanding of what's available. You know, I spoke with Nathan about these numbers, and then we as a team here penciled them out. So I didn't circle back to run it by him, but I kind of got the impression that it might not lead us to eradication, but it's still a very viable tool for managing water lily. So that's what we kind of listed for our management options. We have 2 listed here, option 1 for chemical, option 2 for DASH, recognizing that DASH may not get us to full eradication in the north and south over that time period. So that's something that, you know, I think as a committee, we just have to, you have to weigh whether or not that's the direction we want to go. And then there's also the, you know, the manual removal. I've seen a number of people pop up with chats. They've been removing it from their shorelines and not found it to be too onerous. So I think getting back to that volunteer or landowner component for the north and south basin makes a lot of sense. We also talked about a goal of just containment. So again, getting back to mostly the landowner volunteer perspective, just trying to keep it from spreading to any more populations in the north and south basin based on 2021 populations. And then again, we add the status quo, which is already limited landowner manual removal. So that would continue at a landowner's discretion. So this one's a little, I mean, we all knew this one was going to be a bit challenging. So this one's kind of hard to, you know, kind of spell out whether or not we can get to eradication. I think we could get there probably under option 1. I think eradication is kind of a strong word again, given that we still will have plants in the middle basin. But option 2, we found really favorable. We're just not sure that it's feasible. So I'd actually be curious to hear Alex's perspective on that, since you've been involved in that firsthand.
Yeah, so the fragrant water lily is the most labor intensive species, and it using the dash isn't extremely effective from what I understand from Nathan against it. It is very time consuming. That's why we both recommend, and I spoke to him about this, that herbicide is the best course of action for the water lily, but we can use the dash very effectively against the other species like the slender leaf arrowhead and whatever other species underneath the water that needs to be handled. Aside from milfoil, since that's so small, we'd probably recommend either hiring somebody to do it or have divers hand pull it and then just resurvey every single year or other year to make sure it's going down in size. That's all.
Tony, we also have a couple hands up. Lonnie's had his hand up for a while, so he can go first.
I know in the South Basin, and there's a couple places in the North Basin, that it's the county parks, like the lily pads in the South Lake. That's all in the park. A lot of the arrowheads in the park, and there's some on the south end. But then you have Japanese knotweed and lily pads in the North Lake that's on county property. Is the county going to take and control their own property, or are we going to have to pay for the county's property as well? Because I don't quite see why we should have to pay for taking care of your property that you should be managing, especially the noxious weeds. And I know a lot of the people on the South Lake have the same concern and question. Why are we ponying up the bill for county property?
I can speak to that. So I should say surface water is part of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources at Snohomish County. So while we're not, Parks is also part of that. So I can't directly speak for them, but we work closely together and can communicate with them. So I know this has been a question that came up several times, and I feel bad we haven't addressed it in the plan yet. It's something that would come up in the funding more. In terms of the shoreline species, if they become a high priority, I think there's compelling reasons that the Noxious Weed Control Board would partner with Parks to eliminate those invasive species on the Parks property. And I'd like to see that happen either way, regardless of what the decisions of these plans are. In terms of the water lilies, I think it's a little bit different. It's in the water, that's waters as a state. The Parks does not own the water there. So I think it would largely decide on what the community is going to be doing and the funding mechanism used. Certainly the county would be contributing to this grant and already is in terms of our staff time and other things. So would be contributing that way. If there was a assessment on any parcels, Of course, the county parks would be paying into that as well, and so would the Fish and Wildlife boat launch. Depending on the tool used, for example, the surface water surcharge we'll talk about later, you can do slightly different fee structures based on types of property. So there could be potentially a differential cost charged to the parks, but I don't know if that would be supported by the county or not. But I think we would be treated like other landowners in terms of lily control. And Fish and Wildlife, I think, is in kind of the same boat there. If they're a landowner on the shoreline, just like everybody else, and they're putting the money into the grant program, the state is.
Christine also had her hand raised.
Yeah, I just had a couple questions about the chemical approach. First of all, a couple of different questions, but I think I read in the plan that the water residence time was 0.8 years. Does that refer to how often the lake water is completely exchanged? And then how does that impact, or like if we were to use a chemical? I didn't see anything about like persistence or degradation time or drift. How is that affected in terms of the water turnover, and do these chemicals sink to the bottom and bind to sediments or not? And then also how have these chemicals performed in other lakes? I thought I read that they have been used successfully in other lakes, but was just wondering if there's any further information about that.
I think that's a really good question. The time that you first mentioned does refer more to like how long the water that's physically in the lake will be there before it's flushed out. And so in this particular scenario, we wouldn't really be worried too much about the residence time of the lake so much as maybe wind or any stratification that's going on in the lake that could prevent an herbicide from properly mixing to the water column. Because if it were stratified, so you've got warm water on the top, colder at the bottom, that can actually create like a barrier between different water chemistry as well. So that would be something that we would think more about when the time came, like the timing, look at the water temperature profile, for example, look at the particular chemistry that we've decided for that plant. And then there are different ways of applying these products. Like some are a liquid and then some are in a pellet form. So the chemical itself is actually impregnated in like a clay-based material, so it can sink to the bottom. So sometimes when you're reading about these, you'll hear a couple of different phrases. You'll hear liquid and granular, or you'll also hear systemic or contact. These are terms that come up a lot when people are investigating what makes sense for their system. And we didn't go to that level here, but as far as the residence time of the lake, that wouldn't be my concern so much as that becomes more of an issue when you're dealing like an irrigation canal or a river. Like if you're going to do a treatment in the Columbia River, for example, you need to be very concerned about the amount of time that particular chemical will be in contact with the plant before it just washes right off. So that's not a concern here. But I do think you brought up a good point. I don't recall in the plan if we really drilled into the degradation of these products. Each one is a little bit different. A lot of them are broken down through soil microbes. Sunlight are two of the common pathways. And I think that I can't recall now if we put some of that information in the plan, but I think that would be a really good thing to have in there. To give people a sense for how long they persist. So like Imazapyr and Imazimox, they will persist in the soil, in terrestrial soils. When I say soil, I mean upland. When I say sediment, I mean in the lake. So so they have different pathways of what's going to happen to them. And I think that would be a really good thing to put in the plan so that people have a better understanding. And that might lean into the choice, down the road with, for example, if we did go with a chemical option for fragrant water lily, it might play into the decision of which of these two products, the committee and the community chose to go for. So that's it. I think that's an oversight on my part. I think it should be included.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to make a time note. We have about 20 minutes left and we have a lot of Lily slides. And also we recognize that this is incredibly difficult to, especially the fragrant water lily, to vote without all of the information. And so we decided to hold the polling until we talk about all the options in the north and south and the middle basin. So we have 40 minutes till the end of the meeting, but we have some other slides that I think is really important that Marissa covers, the education and the funding opportunity slides. And so we had slated for us to be done with the management alternatives at 8 o'clock. So sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
I can't see if there is any hand up, so I'm going to continue unless someone stops me.
Can I just add something really quick, Tony, to in terms of the chemical herbicides and their persistence, one of the factors that's evaluated when ecology or EPA approves aquatic herbicide formulations is their persistence. And so products that have a shorter persistence in water are going to be approved much more likely or get that certification because of their rapid breakdown in water. So Harry's shaking his head. I don't know if he has anything to add to that.
I basically agree, and like Procelicure, it breaks down so fast that that's one of the things about that. The low impact to other species is that within 6 days it's already almost gone. So it's doesn't take long for it to totally break down. But on the same token, its contact time in order to be effective is only a day or two that it needs. So it's very aggressive, where other herbicides persist a little longer and they have a longer contact time, but they're not as reactive in the plant either. So
yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, looking at the chat. Okay, so as Shannon said, we're not going to do any voting on lilies until we get through all the basins. So let's move on to the middle basin. And with the middle basin, we have a number of things to talk about because we had more goals. We heard a lot from folks about not only reducing the plant material, but also reducing the muck. So we did look into hydraulic dredging to potentially accomplish both of those. And in this, we decided, given the widespread nature of this plant, eradication, even with hydraulic dredging, is unlikely because hydraulic dredging is not something that's going to, as you probably suspect, it's not going to happen frequently. So it's going to be a one-off, and you're not going to get every little thing out just with that one method, even if you do follow up with some manual approaches. I just don't see that as a viable, especially if you're not going for the eradication in the north and the south basins, because you're always going to have that rhizomes, you're always going to have the seeds, and the hydraulic dredging will get very deep, but it can't get very deep everywhere. So you're still going to have some rhizome bank that persists. So with this management goal, you'll notice it's not in bold, but it was considered. So we did it. We hypothesized a 70 to 80% reduction, which is about 20 or 22 acres, removing about 3 feet of muck, and with a focus on the center navigation in the middle basin. And this pencils out to something on the order of 20 to 25 million. And again, that's a one-time event. And then following that up with some dash manual removal. Again, we're hypothesizing what would be left. So this is an estimate of what this would be, given that we don't know the effectiveness of the hydraulic dredging. And then adding in some manual labor and potentially bottom barriers at residences. So this gets again back to the community role in what you can do right in front of your dock. So again, this is one we considered, because we do recognize that removing muck from the center of the channel is desired by the community, but we didn't recommend it for further consideration, giving its not just high cost, but also the permitting that would be involved to get this accomplished. And you know, one of the, I think I mentioned earlier, one of the disadvantages is finding a place for all of the material that's removed from the lake and the substantial amount of water. So this one didn't move forward.
Tony, I just want to can I make a comment, Tony?
Yeah, yes.
Just so you have a frame of reference, the costs that we're estimating this on are based on current costs relative to the 3 dredging projects I'm currently working on. So we're up to date at 3 different lakes. So it's expensive and they're realistic costs. If you go to your website, you're going to get costs that are based in the 90s and substantially underestimating current costs as they're occurring. Sorry, Tony,
No, that's good. So for the middle basin on our incremental control goals, we have sort of, let me see, 4 altogether, but they're broken up across a number of slides. So I don't know if I should just motor through.
Tony, we do have, Melanie has her hand up.
Okay.
You might have a question on the previous. Go ahead, Melanie.
I just heard Harry say that there were 3 other lakes being dredged, and I was just really curious how they're affording that.
How they're what?
How they're able to afford that price tag in 3 other lakes. I'd be curious how they came up with the funds.
Well, the one lake in Oregon is because it's a drinking water reservoir. It's their cost for keeping the drinking water supply going. The other 2 lakes is homeowners, and so the amount of dredging that they can do each year has been greatly impacted because of the current costs and stuff, and alternatives to try to avoid and periodic dredging to try to cut down on that is something they've gone after. So it's being adaptive is part of it.
Thank you.
Okay, any other hands up?
Nope.
Okay, thank you, sorry. Okay, Marissa, I might lean on you a little bit. Help me explain this one since we broke it up a little bit. So this is also an incremental approach to reducing. This targets a 40 to 50% reduction in the middle basin of 12 to 15 acres, which is about what that covers. Again, in the center of the navigation channel and channel to residences. So this one also, similar to what we discussed earlier, I believe it was yellow flag iris, we have one option that would include chemical, and again, we can hit that multiple times a year at these known 12 to 15 acres. That's a pretty common practice. It's not going to eradicate or even get down to probably our 40% within 1 year. It's going to have to happen repeatedly, which is why the 24 to 30,000 per year pencils out to 110 to 150 over a 5-year period, because you're incrementally decreasing as the rhizome carbohydrate reserves start to become more depleted. You're getting a little bit more bang for your buck. So the annual cost we expect would go down a little bit, but it still have to be multiple times. And again, followed up by DASH, but we couldn't rely on, based on our understanding of how fast plants could be removed using DASH, we didn't feel like this could be a prime focus for even reaching that target, because it's not efficient enough to get to that level. And then again, follow up with some manual non-diver efforts to help maintain the channel and any volunteer work in front of properties. And then again, potentially bottom barriers just for properties. This is more, pretty much anything that's in front of a particular parcel of land. We were really kind of leaning on that would fall more to the landowner, not necessarily part of a larger effort to, like a chemical treatment, for example. And again, it wouldn't rely on the homeowner to do that chemical treatment. It would be more of a community layer under the correct permit. So we felt that this is realistic, especially if we include option 1. The manual or dash, it's probably cost prohibitive to get to that target. It's not that it can't be used and be a part of it, though.
Tony, that's really the next slide. So originally this was in one table where we had both option 1 and 2, option 1 being chemical and option 2 being dash, but we thought it was kind of confusing. So for this meeting, we thought we'd separate it out. So this is basically, in order to get 40 to 50% reduction, your option 1 is to use chemicals, and the cost is 110 to 150,000. Whereas if you just wanted to use manual options, this is what it's going to look like.
Right, so if we relied on dash in that scenario, the cost over the 5-year period goes up exponentially. And again, that assumes that there are contractors available to attack it at the level it would need to. That 12 to 15 acres would be quite aggressive using dash. But from there, to reach that same target, it's questionable whether or not we could, the manual non-diver hand pulling and bottom barriers would get us to that target. So, which if you go back to the previous slide, that's really, I think this is going to be the best option to get to that goal. And again, it really kind of comes back to if folks are unwilling or unable to fund that level of management, then we kind of need to readjust our expectations. Did you want to add anything more to that, Marissa? I feel like I'm not sure I gave that one justice since we split it up.
Well, I think it was just that, when you review something that you put in a plan, it wasn't very clear what the option 1 and option 2 meant, because we originally had it in there basically that the dash couldn't achieve that. The most it could achieve is 5 acres, because that's what we thought one contractor could potentially do. But if you really wanted to go that option and bring in contractors from across the country, this gives you that realistic perspective is all. So, yeah. Oops. Okay. Sorry, I skipped to the next slide. Allison has a hand up.
That's all right. I don't know. Since we're not voting on this right now, I don't know if I should keep going or if there are any hands up that anybody. I see there's
Allison has her hand up.
I recall from the meeting in September of 2019 when Marissa did the original presentation to us that herbicide also had issues, because once you poison something and the matter falls down to the bottom, you're protecting the rhizome, and all you're doing is creating a situation where the rhizome keeps coming back year after year after year. The other thing I've learned recently from a scientist who works with the EPA is that the carriers within the herbicides are more dangerous than the herbicide itself. It's similar to what Teflon has in it, and it doesn't dissipate as easily as the herbicides do. And I've asked for toxicology information on that, and I'd be more than happy to pass it on, but Harry might know more about that. And there's more to just poisoning the lake and getting rid of it. It's not a one and done. It's going to be year after year after year. And what does that do to fish and wildlife and everything else?
I think that probably what you were referring to is with particularly the iris and the lily. A lot of these products like Imazipyr and Imazimox require an adjuvant, which is a carrier. And a lot of those, you're correct, they don't get scrutinized to the same level because they're not held to the same scrutiny. Ecology has looked at a number of these, and there is an approved list of them in the permit. And those vary quite a bit by state, given the evaluation that ecology has put on them. I don't know, I'd have to go back and look to see if they reviewed those. Maybe Harry knows this. I don't know if they reviewed those in the recent environmental impact statement when they redid for the permit. So that might be what you're referring to. I'm not saying that for your benefit, it's just for maybe for the group. So yeah, that is that is a real question that a lot of people, and a real concern. So I'm not sure if I've addressed that, but more just spelling it out for the group, what the backstory is on that.
I think you covered it pretty good. The ecology didn't dive into the chemicals that aid in the adherence, essentially contact for the herbicide to the plant, so the plant absorbs the herbicide, as opposed to floating away, and that's why they add these other chemicals to make it more sticky, so to speak. But because there hadn't been a whole lot of changes relative to their initial EIS relative to the herbicides, but that's where Proselecure is for Eurasian water milfoil is so attractive, is because it doesn't have the adjuvants and it breaks down instantly. So whereas unfortunately for the lilies, we need herbicide that has a little assistance at staying with the plant, and those chemicals are not photooxidized or bacterially degraded very fast, unfortunately.
So one thing I'm hearing for the plan is we should add in for Imazapyr or Imazimox, if any adjuvants are required from them, and then refer that to the EIS statement with toxicological information on those as well, to ensure everybody has all the information ahead of them.
The only problem with that is I don't disagree with that at all, but there's quite a list of surfactants, is another term for this, that are available, and I think that different applicators probably have their preference for which ones are used. So I don't know how easy it would be for us in the plan to spell that out. I mean, I'm trying to think of a metaphor for this. It's sort of like, I guess if someone tells you to go take aspirin and you're trying to decide if you want a brand name or a generic or an off brand, we can't really help make that decision because it's really up to the person who's going to take it. But I mean, we can definitely speak to it, and I think there's value in that, but it would be really hard for us to specify which surfactant should be used.
Actually, some applicators actually just use detergents that are surfactants as part of their cleaning process, and so they, to avoid costs as well as handling and any potential toxicity, they just go with, a lot of them go with detergents, which isn't required under the permit, so it's okay.
One thing I can do is, Christine referred to successful control at other lakes. The King County Noxious Weed Program has done quite a bit of work with Imazapyr and Imazimox for lily control, and that's where we have a lot of our data from. We can check with them to see what, if any, surfactants were used for those treatments, and get back to the committee on that.
And those fact sheets from King County were going to be included as appendices. So you can look and see the rates for each of these products. And I'm almost certain, Marissa, that they listed the specific surfactant and the rate in those fact sheets.
Marissa, I just want to make sure that you realize you're sharing the internet and you're on mute.
Yes, I meant to, but we can keep talking, but I thought I would just pull it up so we can maybe answer this question right now. But maybe we can go on.
Christine has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, because I need to see we need to have the next slide up.
Anyway, I'll move this. Okay.
But go ahead, Christine.
Oh, you just brought up the slide I was going to refer to, was just talking about the mechanical or the harvesting option. And I know that there's been some homeowners that have done some individual harvesting, but I'm not sure how much we've really given the mowing a real go at it, and how this could be integrated whether or not we use a contractor versus volunteer, a volunteer force to try to integrate that into one of the tools to combat the lilies in the middle lake.
Yeah, this one was one that we kind of landed on organically because, again, it kind of got back to the goal. And in this case, to target the center navigation channel, which is approximately 4 to 6 acres, that dash wouldn't be effective. We wanted to present a non-chemical option that was something more than the homeowners could handle. I mean, homeowners aren't going to get out in the middle of the channel, of course. So we kind of landed on some version of a harvester that would make sense. I saw something pop up about logs, and it obviously would not work in areas with logs, and it would probably require a specialized type of harvester. And I mentioned that there are, I don't know if I want to even put a number on it, but there's quite a number of different products out there now. There was one that one of our, Harry and I have a client that has a similar situation with lots of weeds, and there was a fellow in Wisconsin that had developed this system with a big roller that he claimed could still harvest even through areas with a lot of at least cut trees. I don't know if he would sell it for fallen logs that laying sideways, but that's definitely a limiting feature of harvesting, but it is a way to get to that goal. Now, I would say that that management option is in direct conflict with any eradication goal in the North and South Basin. So, if the committee opted to go with harvesting, which I can't believe I'm going to say, but I would not have put this out there, but it kind of landed on this might be an option. But again, it could clear out channels for other plants to grow. The question came up earlier is if milfoil can grow under the lilies. Well, if you take away the lily, they definitely can grow. And also the slender pondweed could expand, and the harvester is unlikely to touch. I doubt it would touch the slender pondweed. It would touch the milfoil certainly because it grows up all the way to the water surface. But that's one of my concerns about that. But it is an option, and we penciled this out to about $32,000 a year, and that's running this several times a year. I know at Lake Tahoe they have the harvesters running 5 days a week. So in the Tahoe Keys, which is of course a much larger area, but they're spending up to, I think it's $400,000 a year, for running that continuously. So your timing is perfect. We did consider it. We are not moving forward with a recommendation for that, but that's just, I like Shannon's idea earlier of having, when we present this to the community, showing what our recommendations were, what you guys recommended to move forward with. And so this is just what we landed on. And then the fourth goal that we have listed here is again,
Tony, David has his hand up.
Can I make a comment before David, just a sec? Most harvesters only harvest down to 5 feet from the water surface. Some can go to 8. So avoiding of the logs can be done because in the mid channel, you're not getting that deep either, but that's all the deeper you're really cutting. That's why it doesn't control all the plants. It really doesn't control the plants. But at Green Lake, for instance, when they were harvesting 30 to 50 acres a year, and they would be harvesting for essentially, they'd harvest for 4 months essentially because they'd spend too much harvesting that acreage and then go back and start again. That was in the 90s. That costed them just to maintain and have the labor to do that harvester was $150,000 a year. So you take inflation and add to it. To expand the acreage to use harvesters gets very expensive, and it's not an eradication kind of thing. It's just a maintenance. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt on the question. Sorry.
David, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know, Christine, if you were referring to what I was doing with the little 4-foot cutter that I have that I've rigged up on a raft that then collects as it cuts. And even though I'm liking that it's working, and I'll be revising that and making it more usable next year, it's pretty small time stuff, and it's great for keeping lanes open for individual homeowners and such. But yeah, I think that, you know, what I'm doing, it might be good, but on the other hand, it probably doesn't belong in the plan here simply because it's really untested, and I don't think it's anything that we can count on. So I think that what I'm doing is kind of an and will happen, continue to work on the side, but probably doesn't belong in this plan if that's what you're talking about.
How about we hear from Allison real quick, and then unfortunately, I think we need to kind of keep going and run our poll questions, and then allow Marissa time to talk about education and funding. Allison?
Yeah, I'm sorry, David, but I tend to disagree with what you're saying. There's at least 3 people now on the Middle Lake that are doing the harvesting, and it's making a difference. The lily pad slayer is doing a great job, and we're seeing more and more benefit from it. It's going to be a long-term effort, but I think community, it's a really creative community. It's a very intelligent community. And I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. And thank you for doing it, because I think it is making a difference.
Real quick before we vote, I just want to, I think we didn't really do a good job of being parallel in our portions, but in the management goals, I think the key is really in what you're getting at is what's realistic, or what percentage of the lilies could be taken care of. So in that middle range goal, you're getting, you know, 40–50% or more over the time. Whereas with the navigation and or the mechanical harvester, the assumption is much lower than that, more like a 10 to, you know, it's basically just keeping that main channel clear. So I just want to make sure everybody understood what that was. And because it gets shallow so fast, even residential channels couldn't be cut clear with that. Just maybe a deeper portion of those residential channels if desired. So it'd just be a small chunk of getting navigation to homes open.
And I just have a point of clarification. I thought the lily slayer was the dash. Is the lily slayer the harvesting, or are they the diver assisted suction harvesting? So different type of harvesting.
It's a different type of harvesting. It's okay. Not give credit to Nathan and what he's done, but I think it's important that we bear in mind that his system that he has developed has had some other iteration by others. So that's why in some part the use of dash in, I think is it this slide? Let me get this out of the way. In the slide that Marissa has up right now, it's still an option, but it would be so expensive, right, to cover that large of area. And that gets back to Marissa's point. It's, you know, if that's the goal to get to that area, it's going to cost a lot, because either someone like the lily slayer is going to have to build up the fleet, because or multiple contractors come in. So, but it's not the same as so this is a diver at the bottom of the lake with the suction, partially pulling up the plant and then letting the suction pull up whatever else he or she can get. Whereas the harvester that we were talking about for goal, I think it's 4, is the harvester on the surface of the water body that uses some kind of mechanical cutter and then harvests as in pulls it out of the lake. So that's why when I was trying to talk about the different options, some of the semantics get a little bit convoluted. So I'm glad you made that clear, Shannon. The dash is the diver, is the slayer, and mechanical on the surface mowing.
Alex, has his hand up. He might have something clarifying.
Yeah, and then let's run the polls after Alex.
So yeah, you're familiar with the lily pad slayer. You've seen his platform. That's Nathan. He's got a couple different contraptions on that thing. One of them is the traditional lily pad cutter. He's mounted up front. He could just drive that thing, plow it through, and cut lily pads and collect it. That's one way he's been doing it over the years. But just this past year, he's built a DASH system. That's the diver assisted suction harvester. So with a man in the water or a woman, they can go take a hose and suck up whatever invasive species is targeted at the end of the hose and pump it straight into a bag on board. So that's extremely effective against the slender leaf arrowhead, but it is not that effective against the lily pads. It takes way longer with the lily pads because the lily pads are, dug in there really deep with those rhizomes. So I've talked to them in length about this stuff, and realistically, if we want to manage the lily pads at all, we need herbicide. Now we can use the DASH system for the slender leaf arrowhead, no problem. I mean, we can use all the divers we have at our disposal in the community to tackle that over the year or years it takes to do that. But I mean, realistically with the lily pads, there's no way. I mean, even with the DASH system, like that, our only realistic, feasible way to do it is herbicide. So that's that.
Okay, I think for the two voting questions that we have, it might make most sense to go back to the table that they're referring to, because the first one is the North and South Basin. Looking at these management goals. Yeah, so I'm going to launch that now and then read it out to you guys. So these ones are a little bit more complex, so take your time. Which management goal for fragrant water lily should the committee recommend for the North and South Basin? So 1, eradication of the isolated patches. 2, reduction using DASH. 3, containment, really up to the individual landowner. Or 4, no action. We only have about half the people voting so far. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share. So we have 50% eradication of the isolated patches in the North and South, and then 50% up to the individual landowner. Thank you. Now I will go ahead and start the next poll. Marissa, do you want to move to, I don't know how to do this because they're over a couple slides. So this one includes everything. The 70 to 80% reduction with the dredging, and then the 2 options, maybe put it on the option. Yeah, I guess there's 2 different tables. So this includes all of them.
Basically all the options for the Middle Basin.
Right, let me launch it. There's a lot of options. Okay, so which management goal for fragrant water lily should the committee recommend for the Middle Basin? So the first one, reduction 78% using dredging. Option 2, or goal 2, option 1, reduction. Can you guys read this? There we go. If you make it bigger, you might be able to read it. I'm not sure if you have the.
Mine is showing up fine on my screen.
Okay, mine doesn't show up, so I can't read it all the way. Relying on chemical treatment first as the primary method, and then the other methods as follow-up. Goal 2, option 2 is 40 to 50%, relying on DASH as the primary method, and manual and barriers as the follow-up methods. Management goal 3, maintain navigation channel and deep portions of resident channels using the harvester. And then management goal 4, no action. And it looks like we've had 5 people so far voting, so we're still waiting for the votes to come in.
We haven't really thought about with 5 options if we should change our criteria of what.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, well, I guess.
Yeah,
I didn't think of that till now.
So here's what I'm thinking would maybe be the best way to present this to the community is take the actual percentages.
Yeah.
And work them into the table. And that way the community really understands how the steering committee fell. And so speaking of adaptive management, we are learning as we go through this process, because this is such a complicated plan and a complicated issue that we're dealing with. So
do you want to say that not everyone has voted on this? So I will just prompt one more time. We still have 2 people that have not voted. And these
Alex
votes
has
are
his-
anonymous, so I don't know who's not voting.
Alex has his hand raised. It might be a point of clarification before he votes.
Alex, would you like to say something?
No, sorry, I don't know how that got up there.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay, everyone has voted, so I will share the result. So we have 17% for dredging, and then 50% for goal 2, option 1, relying on chemical treatment as a primary method. 17% for goal 2, option 2, as dash is the primary method. Nobody voted for mechanical harvesters, and 17% for no action. Okay. Tony, back to you, or is it Marissa?
I think at this point, and we have 15 minutes left, I think Marissa can go to the next slide, or slide 37. I lost track of where we were. And talk a little bit about the education and the funding, because I really do think these are important pieces. And I am really thankful that you all are hanging in there, because this is a long meeting.
Okay, I think we can do this. Education part is one of the most critical ones, but is a little more straightforward. I see Allison has her hand up though first, so Allison, can you go maybe really quickly?
Yeah, I just want to say, I don't think that that was a fully representative poll. And I think that likely we need to probably redo that one. So I think it needs to be a combination of a number of things, and put in herbicides with the bottom barriers and the mechanical, harvesting, that it's one of those, and just mechanical harvesting, bottom barriers or whatever. But I don't think we had all the options we needed.
Okay,
Just
Allison.
a point of clarification, when we talked about each of the goals, it was a primary method to kind of hit it hard. And then all of those other options that were listed with that goal were to use in combination. So the bottom barrier still be used, dash still be used as a follow-up. But as you look through these tables, it is very complicated, but it wasn't just a singular thing. So management goal number 2 contains all of these things, including channel maintenance and bottom barriers.
And I guess I'd follow up, if you have suggestions of a way to better organize that, or a different combination that you didn't see, follow up after the meeting. As I said, education is one of the most critical things. I think this is a recurring theme. Through those tables, a lot of those things are achieved by education. So getting people to do that removal of invasives on their property is only going to be achieved by education. Preventing Roesiger from getting some other disasters, plant or animal, is only going to be achieved through education. So we don't want to minimize, ignore it, just the way the plan is structured. All those control options come first, and then education comes later. That doesn't mean we have to present to the community this way, but this is how we did it, for better or for worse. So here are the education plan components that we had come up with that's been successful or not at other lakes. So I'm just going to run through these. The first table is specifically an education plan components about prevention. So the next table is going to be talking about education about control on your own property. So for prevention, there's a couple mechanisms that can work. The first is a boat wash station. And this was something that was brought up in the last meeting as desirable to look into. And there are a couple options there, ranging from a fully manned station that you can't enter the lake without a permit, such as they use at Lake Whatcom, to having just a passive boat washing station that people are there, or that people can use. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get our cost estimates back from our inquiries on this, but it is a rather expensive endeavor. It requires the infrastructure to upgrade it. You have to have water and electricity added to the boat launch. You have to get permissions from Fish and Wildlife. And then once you get it, you have to purchase the equipment and then maintain and install it and potentially staff it. So while we don't have the cost estimates there, we will have them for the plan. And if you you know, we're going to ask you to vote on which things you want to include. And if you want to vote on this one until you get further costs, but our recommendation is not recommended at this time. But we do see that there's been some improvements in technology, and this might be something that comes down in cost a lot that maybe in the future would be a good recommendation. The next one is a tool that's used, has been used at some lakes for volunteer outreach at boat launches. So you could have community members volunteer and go out on busy weekends to the boat launch and have like an informational brochure, or just like, hey, did you know you're supposed to check your boat before you leave, and before you enter the lake and before you leave, to make sure you're not transmitting invasive species. So there would have to be some outreach materials that go with that, which there are already good ones out there that we could just be duplicated, and time for volunteer training, and you know, community members would have to volunteer their time. So it would be a fairly cheap endeavor, but it's a pretty big ask of the community to do, to have volunteers to do that. But it is an option that can be really successful. And it's one of the, in the first column here, I put which the target audience is. So one of the few things can really get at those external users. They're a hard group to reach, is external users to the lake, because they're so diffuse. The last one is signage for external uses. There already is a giant milfoil sign at Lake Roesiger. So we have not recommended this simply because there's something already there. The sign could be adapted to better include like clean, drain, and dry your boat message, which would get at some of the other invasive species like zebra mussels or New Zealand mud snails. It's not really plants, but they do exist out there. Whereas ours is really check your boat for plant fragments, is what it says right now. So this could be an option, but it's something that we didn't include. The last one is outreach to residents. So this target audience is really the internal users. People do bring their boats in and out of the lake that live there. So we could develop and implement an outreach campaign specifically for your community. So things like email, next door. If you have a community event, this could be like something, you know, set up like a booth or something to talk about it. So those are the education plans with regards to prevention. And then I'm going to go through both of these first, Jen, and then we can do the polls quickly because we're just so close out of time here. The next one is really focused on landowner invasive plant control. This was definitely a message that came through loud and clear in the first meeting, is that your community is very interested in educating landowners for action. So the first option to do this is landowner workshops. So Lake Ballinger, for example, is another lake community that recently completed one of these plans, and they had workshops where experts presented the control methods that individual properties can do. This could be something that is kind of live and interactive at a lake area, or it could be something held on Zoom if things persist the way they are. But really walking through what you can do and what you can't do with and without permits, and what those tools look like and what it takes. King County does these for knotweed control that have been fantastic. I went to one to figure out how to control my property. It kind of empowers people to take action on their own. The second, I put in lake-wide shoreline planting, just because if you do take out all that vegetation, you might need to plant something and it's free. So I put it in. And lastly, an outreach campaign. And I think this is where Allison has provided some really good input as well. If you're going to effectively get to people, you really need to develop an outreach strategy. You need to figure out what tools are going to get to your target audience, what are the messages that are going to resonate with them, and then you need to plan it out to have those messages be delivered multiple times over a period for them really to, you know, obtain, and then put that messaging to use on their own property. So this would be things again like next door, emails, other things to have repeated messages going out. This is something that we do a lot through our Lake-Wise program and other issues. So it would either be county staff time or volunteer time, like community, depending on how big of an effort you wanted this to be, that would be scalable based on funding. So that's a super quick overview. Does anybody have any questions or ideas of things that are missing from this list? Allison?
I just want to say we need a combo of many of those. So trying to vote on a poll for one is frustrating.
Oh, and for this, say that this is multiple choice for these educational components, so you can vote for as many as you want.
Thank you. That's great.
Any other questions? Okay, so Jen, if you want to launch a poll, go ahead.
So this is the first one talking about prevention. And so, like I said, this is multiple choice, so you can select as many as you would like. What prevention components should the committee recommend? Select all that you recommend. So it's boat wash station at the public launch, volunteer outreach at the public boat launch, additional signage at the public boat launch, outreach campaign. I did put other in here just in case you did have other ideas, and you can reach out to us afterwards.
But yeah, if you do vote for other, you need to tell us what other is
maybe
afterwards.
say what the other is. So far we have 2 others, so I'm interested to hear what these others are.
And maybe I would recommend sending that other in an email to Marissa and Jen.
Or if you want to private chat it right now or put in the chat right now.
Oh yeah, put it in the chat. That would work. Yeah.
We need one more person to vote. Unless someone is left and I didn't pay attention. Okay, so let me share the results. Okay, so an overwhelming 83% of you would like an outreach campaign. 42% boat wash station, 67% volunteer outreach at the launch, 25% additional signage, and 3 people said other. And then I'm going to launch the next one. So this last poll, I know you love polls, is on the next table, Marissa, your education. If you want to advance the slide so they can see what they're voting on. Okay. What education components should the committee recommend? Select all that you would recommend. So the first one is landowner workshops for invasive plant control. Second one is lake-wise shoreline planting. And the third is an outreach campaign to identify native or invasive species and control options. And then again, I did put other. So if you do select other, please share with us what that is. Just need a few more people to participate. Okay. And so 50% said landowner workshops, 75% lake-wise shoreline plantings, 83% outreach campaign, and 2 individuals selected other. So please put your other ideas in the chat. All right.
And I just, one sec, I just want to give us a quick time. It's 8:28. And if you all are okay sticking around for a few minutes longer, I think what Marissa has to say is very important. And we have 1, 2, 3. We have some very quick slides left. Go for it.
So to kind of get the funding discussion rolling, I thought it might be helpful to just give you a like mud on the wall cost scenario of everything together that we've been talking about. So this was just an assumption, not saying this is what you're going to vote on, but kind of based on the recommendations of what Tetra Tech had recommended in the plan of what it would look like if we did a combination of elements. So I'd put in milfoil diving here. So if we decide that's the high priority to eradicate, we put in what milfoil diving might look like over a 5-year total. I think I might have underestimated in year 3 to 5 a little bit there because I did this very quickly. But lily herbicide treatment, if you decided to go for that 40 to 50% with lily herbicides, and then doing dash to either clean up lilies or supplement them, or with the arrowhead, an outreach campaign, and then you throw in project managing and permitting, you're looking at about 90-some thousand the first couple of years and less in years 3 to 5. So I just threw out there a per parcel cost of what that might look like so people get a estimate. This is all 464 parcels on the lake shoreline paid an equal amount. There are different ways to structure that, which we'll talk about. But just to give you an idea of what we're even talking about per person, because I think when we present these options, we'll go with kind of the recommendations given and present more options to the community a little bit. This gives you an idea of what that means to you as an individual, what this will cost.
And I just want to add, please ignore the total column. That is not total debt. That doesn't mean anything. Just don't look at it.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what you mean, Jen.
In total, you would assume that you've totaled 5-year costs, but you did not total 5-year costs.
Oh, the column to the very right. I'm sorry. The bolded column down here is correct. I'm sorry. Like I said, I threw this in right before the thing started, just because I thought this is something that's important. So ignore this total column to the right, but the total on the bottom and the per parcel is about the annual cost per person. So we can revise this slide and send out, but we didn't really know what to give you because we didn't know what options you're actually interested in. But just wanted to give you a little bit of perspective before I started talking about funding. So you've heard about the funding mechanisms before already, most of you who have been involved in past meetings or have had lots of communication, but I'm going to just run through them. As you know, the biggest source of funding is going to be an ecology implementation grant through the Aquatic Invasive Plant Management Program. There's a $100,000 max for these grants. So it's a 75% grant from ecology and 25% match from the community. So in order to apply for this, there needs to be $25,000 in cash or some sort of in-kind contribution of the community that's meaningful to the goals of the plan. Funding has to be spent in 2 years. So this is a 2-year grant, just like this one is. So this one we're going to be finishing this year. And you actually can reapply after the initial 2 years, but it's less competitive. So you might not get funded and you might be able to come back and keep applying until they fund you, but it's not guaranteed. And it also requires county staff availability, which when there's lots of lakes with competing issues, we might not be able to actually support applying for that. The considerations for more successful applications, I did bring this one up when we talked about milfoil. It's definitely higher prioritized for higher class weeds. So class A weeds just get funded if they're a new infestation. Ecology's got a special pot of money for them to handle the early infestation grants. But competitive applications are typically involve a class B noxious weed, especially if designated for control. These others, there's nothing necessarily in the guidelines that say thou shalt get points for this per se, but it needs to include education and prevention because it is definitely important to not spread plants to other lakes. And it also is really valuable if the community is invested. So if there's a volunteer effort, if there's match contributions, and then most importantly, if this is a long-term plan, invasive aquatic plant control is a long-term prospect. No matter what you do, you're not going to solve this problem in 2 years. So they're going to be more likely to fund things that are going to have longer-term funding and commitment from the community in place. So Allison, I see you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes, so the 75,000 that you're talking about is going to be spent by December?
Of this, no. So we would apply, so let's say we finish this grant this year. So the grant we're currently working on, that can take up to 2 years, but we'll be finishing it by this November is the goal. So we can apply for a new grant in December, which is when the funding grant deadline is due, so that it would become available in July 2022 through June 2024.
All right, I'm still confused. So the amount of money that is being spent is basically in the time and labor that you guys have done doing this study, not actually doing anything.
No, right. So this is a separate grant. We have a current grant right now, which is specifically for the development of the plan.
Okay.
It's not this 100, that one's a whole different category, and the funding limit on that I think is $35,000.
So we're in a planning grant right now. So that's totally separate. This is the implementation grant that we would go for with this finalized plan. We need this plan finalized and approved by ecology in order to even apply for that implementation grant.
Okay.
And they make you do the plan first, partly because it can be such a divisive issue in the community. So they want to make sure the community has a solid plan and everyone's on board with it before they're going to fund implementation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more questions on this? Okay, so whether it be this 25% match or that long-term funding after year 2, there's got to be money that's coming from the lake community. So there's a couple ways you can do this. So one, you can get lake association collections. So this is what you've been doing to this point to fund your aquatic plant control activities. If the plan is really just to continue status quo, then this is probably a good fundable option, is just having lake association collections. So there's a wide range of formal to informal. It's typically volunteers or donations, unless you have a mandatory, system established through your legal structure, which I don't believe is the case at Lake Roesiger right now. So the pros is you've already got some structure in place to have a bank account and collect money. It's really flexible because you can ramp up and ramp down as you need, and you can do everything independent of the county. So you can go hire your contractors, do whatever you want without involving any other entity. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. The cons is it can be inequitable. Some people are never going to contribute but get benefits from it, and it provides a huge amount of uncertainty in funding each year. The second action is a lake management district. It is a legal mechanism to tax lake area landowners that was put into place by the state in order to fund things just like this, or lake health. There was one established in Lake Roesiger in the 80s to fund the lake health study that was done there. It can be really effective, allows for a broad range of actions, and it's a completely fair democratic process. There's an extensive public process, including votes that get sent to everybody and mailed back in. But we found through our experience with the Lake Roesiger study and another at Goodwin and Shoecraft that it's very complicated. It's not flexible at all. It can require a bond to start, and it costs about $30,000 to start up, and that was back in the 90s. So the overhead is very high to get this going, but it is an option in the toolbox. And the third one is the surface water fee surcharge. So this is the one we've talked about a lot in the past. So basically, surface water management is your surface water utility for the county. Each of you pay on your tax bill a certain amount each year that goes through the management of our stormwater infrastructure. So all the ditches, culverts, and everything that carry water across the county, funds flooding, a warning, and flood reduction options. It funds all of the water quality improvements and testing done in streams and lakes, including our lakes program, et cetera. So you can approach your county council person and say, we would like to be taxed more. And that money can only be used for improving the lake health. So things like control. In other areas, they've done things to reduce lake flooding or improve lake health. So we've set these up for Lake Ketchum, Lake Goodwin, Shoecraft, and Lake Serene in the county already. It's the pros is it's equitable, so it's on your tax bill, so everybody has to pay, unless you're a senior that's already exempted from taxes. So it does provide some relief for those that really can't afford to pay additional amount of taxes. The fee structure can be decided by the community within legal limits. So, for example, at Goodwin and Shoecraft, there's people that, there's a community beach lot, and then there's like 100 parcels that all have access to that. They get charged at a lower rate than others. It could potentially even be structured. I don't know for sure if it's legal or not, but let's say there's some people that are receiving more benefits than others. It's possible they might get charged more than others in that fee structure. But the important thing is whatever fee structure you decide upon, it's got to be agreed upon and accepted by the community. It's a lot less administratively costly than starting a lake management district. The cons, it takes 1 or 2 years to set up depending on the start of the process. So basically, we have to send what our surface water fees are to the assessor's office by December. So if you don't have it all approved by December, you can't get it started till the next year. And it must be renewed every 5 years. So the county council, you have to redo the process, which we'll talk about next, every 5 years. And because it's set up, the county has to do the contract management. So if we're collecting funds and you want to hire a harvester contractor, an herbicide contractor, we have to run and manage that contract and reimburse out. We can't have the community do it and then we pay them or reimburse them because of the legal framework. The process is you develop your proposal. So what the goals are that you want specifically to be in there, what the rates would be for each type of lot. And you can look in our county code that I referenced in the last slide to see what this looks like for the other lakes. You meet with your county council representative and you present them the proposal. They're going to want to see that there's community support for this. They're not going to want to introduce it to the county council unless it's broadly supported. So you would send a mailer probably and hold a public meeting so the community could get like a rough vote on it. You know, they're not going to expect everybody to be ahead of support of it, but a good percentage. I don't know what that percentage would be, but then it will go through the public hearing and council vote should they decide to introduce that. If it passes, the assessment data gets sent in December for the following year tax bill, and then we can begin work the following year. So,
Allison has her hand up.
Allison, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, so I understand that it has to be voted on by everybody whose property touches the water, but what about everybody that is surrounding the lake too? That has a stake?
You mean like people across the street?
Yeah.
So the legal framework is that whoever is being charged must receive a benefit for it. So if you think there's a strong nexus that there is a benefit to those living across the lake, that would allow potentially for it to be legal for them to be taxed. The second piece is you have to balance the idea of it with them being supportive of it, right? So if you say, well, we're going to tax everybody across the lake $200 a year, and there's a lot of people that show up at county council saying we don't want it, it's probably not going to pass. So it's kind of that balance when you decide your fee structure of making sure it's supportable, but you're also making sure that people benefit from it are paying for it.
Okay, thank you.
And just for context, the other lakes that we do have these set up on are exclusively lake shoreline landowners, aside from the properties that do share access. So a lot of the HOAs and uphill properties will have a shared access property on this lake, and they do get charged because they receive a benefit.
But I don't think there's any of those on Lake Roesiger.
No, I don't think so.
Any questions?
There are some, but not many.
Okay, yeah, and if there were those, that would be something we need to identify. We did an initial assessment with our kind of GIS person to look for that, and he didn't find that shared property, so that would be really important to know. Okay, oops. So that's all on funding mechanisms. So that's going to be what's going to get us to implementation. So I know that was quick, but it will be incorporated into the plan as well. And then is this Shannon, back to you on next steps?
I think, how about you tackle it?
Sure. Okay. So the next step is that we're going to take all of the information that you provided tonight and we're going to incorporate it into the draft plan. We're going to have to debrief a little bit to see if there's any more information we need from you to be able to do that effectively. But the goal is to send the draft plan to the community by 10/1 or October 1st. And it won't just be the draft plan because we sent it to you and it's dense, it's hard. So in order to make that more digestible, the community will be doing a draft executive summary that summarizes the options. Tony will be putting together a recorded presentation. So many of the slides that you saw tonight, but maybe to a slightly recognizing the audience, trying to make it simple and straightforward. And along with that, we'll be having a survey for the feedback. So we'll be working on the survey. That's going to be probably one of the most challenging things, just like, you know, a couple of you point out tonight, you felt the survey was frustrating, is making sure we develop that survey effectively. So we might have tests run that survey with you all to see how it works. And then we would give until the 17th to get feedback on that from the community. So we would be sending that out to everybody. There is a mailer ready to go out to let people know the survey and plan is available online. So that would be going out to everybody. There would also be next door posts and emails on that. Then we would have a community meeting, and this is where we need to kind of lean on you somewhat, the week of 10/25 or 11/1. We need to finalize a date. The idea is that community meeting would be run by your community club. Had some conversations with Brian around this, but Tetra Tech would be presenting the plan in brief, just a brief review of what the plan included and the feedback that was received from the community, summarizing that would help you as a community finalize that plan. Then the idea is to submit the final plan to Ecology 1112, and if there is desire to move forward on IAVMP grant from the community, we would need to get that application ready by December 1st. So Jen and I would be working on that concurrently with finishing the plan to get ready and just basically fill in what those final steps would be. Questions spelled wrong, anybody? Melanie?
I was just wondering about, I feel a little lonely in my suggestion, and I don't know if it's a silly suggestion but I'm going to ask again, has any kind of matching ever been done? Because we could get more per dollar if there was some motivation for some private landowners who wanted to treat or, eliminate in any way barriers or herbicides or whatever they chose to do, if rather than designate money for channels like you talked about, there was money that was matching that they could apply for, like we take $10,000 and say, that's split up against anybody amongst anyone who wants to pay for their own lily pad treatment along their own shorelines.
I'm not sure if you're looking for a response from us or the community, if others this year interested in it.
I just was curious if that was something that had ever been done, or whether I'm just kind of crazy.
So that's something that a community could do and a community could track, but that is unlikely something that the county would manage because it would potentially be very inequitable. We're very restrictive on how we can do matches and taxing and things like that. So we've laid out the creative ways that we as surface water employees could help you.
It's hard to hear.
Oh.
Yeah, your audio went, Jen.
There we go.
Yeah.
Do you want, I think I can say what you were trying to say. So yeah, I think the idea of matching funds, I think what Jen's trying to say is a great idea. And if the community wants to try and pull that together, it's something we could definitely, or would be definitely supportive of, but we're really restricted in how we administer and transfer funds and ensuring that public dollars don't go to like personal benefit. So we do have some restrictions that way. When you say matching funds too, it brings up the other side of it. Could things that individual property owners do as volunteers contribute to matching funds to meet that $25,000 grant match is the other piece of it. And I know that's not exactly what you're getting at, but I know that's one thing that like Alex was saying, potentially if those divers and others are volunteering to go out and do dash for Slender Arrowhead, that can qualify potentially as match for the grant. There are some logistical issues in there in terms of liability and risk management. If the county's allowing that as match, again, I don't know, there'd have to be insurance, right? Like, so there's some logistical things to work out, but if, for example, private landowners you had, and you knew 10 private landowners were going to install bottom barriers and they're going to pay for it themselves, that could potentially go towards that meeting that $25,000 match too. It would be the other piece of it to try and reduce the financial burden of the community. But we'd have to be able to document that and have a very clear paper trail on that. So like, to submit to ecology. So it does get logistically difficult. So we want to make sure all of our ducks in a row were in a row before we included something like that in a grant application. Harry, Tony, I don't know if you have any other experience from other lakes that could add to that.
No, you stated it pretty well. It's the issue of what's done as a volunteer comes under a shared liability and things that are agreed upon prior to taking that action and stuff. But it's something that can, it's an adaptive program that has to be talked through and everybody has to agree to it and stuff up front as well.
And I don't want to discourage it because I feel like government is just, we tend to be the discouraging ones because of it just, there's more complications that come with it. So if this is something like, if you have some ideas that, if you want to more formalize that, lay it out and kind of a little bit of a plan that we could consider and figure out how to incorporate that plan, I'm certainly open to that.
Yeah. Part of the problem with the matching funds that volunteers do to qualify for matching is the documentation of that. So the labor time, the expenses, all has to be extremely documented. And so and when that's occurring and stuff, the liability issue is an issue that has to be resolved too. Who's bearing the liability? The volunteers doing the match, the organization that's providing the match, or the county. that's complicated.
And honestly, too, in terms of your volunteer time for this grant, the reason that it's easier is because the county actually is putting so much in that we've already met the match requirements just with our staff time. So your volunteer time is basically what gave us the go ahead for management to approve us doing this project. So we're actually not submitting the paper trail of your volunteer efforts to the ecology for this grant. We are submitting your receipt to Seascapes though, just so you know. Okay, so I think that's it. I know there's been a lot discussed in this meeting, so if you have follow-up thoughts or comments or things that you would like to see that you're just maybe don't even thinking of right now or just didn't feel comfortable sharing during the meeting, please do email me or Janet about this. So I think you all have my email by now, so just reply to one of those emails.
Can I make a comment?
Is that Lena?
Yes.
Sure.
So question regarding the granting of money, which will have to come from the homeowners around the lake. So I understand that we can possibly somehow make everybody pay for the improvements. So again, how do we accomplish that?
That was that surface water management fee surcharge that the last two slides were about. Is
right.
The most likely option. The Lake Management District would also achieve that, but is more administratively costly. So that could not be in place for any sort of funding next year at this time, but it would be something that you could get going starting in 2022 if there was support for that.
So are you saying that we have to try and get the community to support this versus an assessment to the landowners?
You would need community support either way. So in order for us to apply for the grant, the community needs to commit to $25,000 in match for $100,000 for the $75,000 from ecology. So that could come from personal donations. That could partly come from in match if it was contributing to the plan goals meaningfully. But you wouldn't be able, if you wanted for us to apply this year, to have a mandatory assessment in place. Another option is to wait, get a mandatory assessment in place and then apply for a grant as well. So either way, you're going to need broad community support if you're going to get public dollars to fund plant control projects at the lake. Now, the only thing without getting broad community support maybe is some of the outreach options. You know, there might be some partnering there potentially if you didn't have broad community support and funding.
Okay, so to quantitate if individual and landowners want to apply for a permit to have their property sprayed for lily pads, so will that affect the grant going forward?
It would be extremely unwise. Well, I mean, I guess you're going to get decisions in terms of what this plan looks like. If the community widely decides not to do herbicides, it seems like that's a reasonable thing for individual landowners or a group of landowners to move forward and do and apply for that permit. And it will go through the permit process and be open to community review. Hopefully the contractor would do it right this time. So there wasn't such community grief about it one way or the other. But if the community did move forward and did use herbicide as an option, and we applied for a permit, assuming it is with the county and county funds and through this grant, the county would hold the permit for the lake and individual landowners would not be able to apply on top of that.
Okay.
Okay, I see one more hand from Melissa. And then we probably really should call it because it's almost 9.
Yeah.
Alyssa, are you there?
Yes, okay. So when you say broad community support, do we have to have a certain percentage of people when we vote on whatever solutions we decide? do we have to have a certain amount of percentage to side with one or another, or is it just like majority rules?
I think there's two pieces there. There's the piece of finalizing the control plan, and I'm going to defer to Tony and Erie on that one. The second piece is on funding. If you have a plan in place and you're going to your county council person to ask for increased funding, you would definitely need broad support. I don't know what that threshold is, but your county council person would be able to give you a better idea on that. But at Goodwin and Shoecraft, when we did the most recent assessment, they had about, I think, 85% or more voting to be taxed to do more control work.
Okay.
Harry, do you want to quickly talk about consensus?
The plan across several states, including Washington, it's a majority supporting the plan. That's how, without the grant, you're not going to get a grant just because you have a plan in place if the community doesn't support it. So it's a simple majority, but that's important.
And I should say too, you're never going to get consensus on a plan like this. Just looking at communities across the board, there's always going to be a differences of opinion, just like any other issue.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, thank you for sticking around longer than 8:30. We, like Marissa said, threw a lot at you. And if you have any comments or feedback or recommendations to adjust wording or suites of control options, please email Marissa, and she shares all of those emails with us. And thank you again for your participation. So with that, I think we can stop recording and end the meeting.
All right, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.